Picture this. It's 1870, and a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann stands on a windswept hill in northwestern Turkey, holding a copy of Homer's Iliad in one hand and a shovel in the other. The local farmers think he's mad. The academic establishment has dismissed him as a wealthy amateur, but Schliemann believes something that will change archaeology forever, that Troy was real. As his workers dig deeper into the ancient mound called Hisarlik, they uncover walls, then gold, then evidence of a massive fire that destroyed a Bronze Age city around 1180 BCE, exactly when ancient sources say Troy fell. But here's the question that will drive our entire journey today. Was the Trojan War history or myth? Were Achilles, Hector, and Helen real people, or brilliant fiction? And if Troy was real, what actually happened there over 3,000 years ago? To answer these questions, we need to become detectives, following clues that span nearly 30 centuries, from Bronze Age ruins to ancient Greek poetry, from Roman historians to modern archaeological science. We'll examine every major source, from Homer's immortal epics to the fragments of the epic cycle, from Herodotus to Virgil, from medieval chronicles to the discoveries that continue to this day. But our story doesn't begin in a library or laboratory. It begins with a single moment that supposedly changed the course of history. A moment when the most beautiful woman in the world made a choice that would launch 1,000 ships and doom 2 civilizations. Close your eyes and travel back with me 3,200 years to a world where bronze was the hardest metal known to man, where kings ruled from stone fortresses, and where the gods themselves took sides in human wars. Travel back to the late Bronze Age, to the world of heroes and city sacker, the world of the Trojan War. It's dawn in the year 1200 BCE, and the world is waking up in a way that would be utterly alien to Homer's audiences living 5 centuries later. There are no marble temples gleaming white on hilltops, no democratic assemblies debating in stone agoras, no philosophers pondering the nature of existence under shady colonnades. Instead, as the sun rises over the Aegean Sea, it illuminates a Bronze Age world of power and splendor that would vanish like a dream, leaving only fragments and memories behind. Picture the coast of Greece, or Hellas as it was never called then, in the pre-dawn darkness. Massive stone fortresses crown the hilltops like sleeping giants, their cyclopean walls built of limestone blocks so huge that later Greeks would believe only the one-eyed Cyclopes could have lifted them. These are the citadels of the Mycenaeans, the Wanacs, the warrior kings who rule this land with bronze-tipped spears and chariots imported from the distant east. As the first light touches the fortress of Mycenae, guards on the walls can see for miles across the Argive plain. The famous Lion Gate, with its massive stone lions guarding the entrance, stands silent and imposing. Inside the citadel, the Megaron, the great hall of the king, still echoes with the previous night's feast. The walls are painted with frescoes showing blue-skinned gods, hunters chasing wild boar, and warriors in boar's tusk helmets driving war chariots into battle. But this isn't a primitive world of simple warriors. As dawn breaks fully, scribes are already at work in the archive rooms, carefully inscribing clay tablets with a script we call Linear B, the earliest form of written Greek. They're recording everything: how many sheep belong to the goddess, which bronzesmiths owe taxes to the palace, how much perfumed oil should be stored for the upcoming religious festival. These tablets reveal a complex bureaucratic state that rivals anything in the ancient world. At Pylos, in southwestern Greece, we have over 1,000 of these tablets, preserved when the palace burned around 1200 BCE. They tell us about a world of meticulous record-keeping, where the king's scribes tracked everything from land tenure to livestock, from military equipment to religious offerings. The tablets mention people with names that echo Homer's heroes, Achilles, possibly Achilles, and dozens of others whose names would be familiar to anyone who knew the ancient epics. These weren't mythological figures to the Bronze Age Greeks. They were real people, perhaps kings and warriors whose deeds were already being sung by palace bards. Now let your mind's eye travel across the wine-dark Aegean, past islands that rise from the sea like the homes of gods. The Cyclades, scattered across the blue water like stepping stones between worlds. Past Crete, where the Minoan civilization still clings to its trading posts, though its great palaces have fallen. Past Rhodes, where Bronze Age merchants stopped to trade copper from Cyprus for tin from the far north. Your journey ends on the coast of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where the morning sun illuminates a very different but equally sophisticated world. The western coast of Anatolia in 1200 BCE is a coastline of kingdoms. Unlike Greece, with its hilltop fortresses and warrior kings, this is a land of wealthy trading cities that have grown rich from their position between Europe and Asia. The Mediterranean world's most valuable trade routes pass through here, carrying tin from the distant Caucasus, precious stones from Afghanistan, ivory from Africa, and amber from the foggy shores of the Baltic Sea. Picture yourself walking through one of these cities in the pre-dawn darkness. The streets are narrow but well paved, lined with workshops where craftsmen are already at work. The sound of bronze hammers rings out from smithies where masters are forging weapons and jewellery with techniques passed down through generations. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, cooking food, olive oil, and the distinctive scent of fresh-worked bronze. In the distance, dominating the landscape, rises the greatest of all these Anatolian cities. Its name varies depending on who's speaking. The Greeks call it Wilios or Ilios, the Hittites know it as Wilusa, and its own people might have called it Wilusia. We know it as Troy, and in 1200 BCE, it's one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities in the Bronze Age world. Troy sits on a hill overlooking the entrance to the Dardanelles, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia and controls access to the Black Sea. Every ship that wants to trade with the rich kingdoms of the north must pass by Troy's walls, and Troy's kings have grown fabulously wealthy taxing this trade. The city that archaeological evidence reveals is impressive by any standard. Massive walls built of carefully fitted limestone blocks rise 30 feet above the surrounding plain. These aren't crude fortifications but sophisticated defences, with towers positioned for overlapping fields of fire and gates designed to channel attackers into killing zones. Inside the walls, the city is a marvel of Bronze Age urban planning. Wide paved streets lead from the gates to the citadel at the summit, where the king's palace dominates the skyline. The palace itself is built in the Anatolian style, not like the Greek megaron with its single great hall, but as a complex of interconnected rooms around courtyards, with separate quarters for the royal family, administration, religious ceremonies, and storage. Archaeological excavations have revealed houses that speak of wealth and sophistication. Multi-story buildings with ground floors for workshops and storage, upper floors for living quarters. Elaborate drainage systems that carried waste away from the city, public wells that provided fresh water, and everywhere, evidence of international trade, pottery from Greece, jewellery from Egypt, weapons from the Caucasus, amber from the Baltic. But Troy in 1200 BCE is also a city under pressure. The archaeological evidence from Troy 7a, the layer that corresponds to the traditional date of the Trojan War, shows signs of hasty preparation for siege, storage jars buried in house floors, as if families were hiding food for a long conflict, walls reinforced with rubble fill, overcrowding as people from the surrounding countryside crowded inside the walls for protection. Something was coming. Whether it was the Greek army of legend or some other threat, the people of Troy in their final years were preparing for war. But Troy didn't stand alone in the Bronze Age world. To understand the full context of our story, we need to journey inland, across the Anatolian plateau, to the capital of the greatest superpower of the age, the Hittite Empire. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, sits in the heart of modern-day Turkey, about 200 kilometers east of Ankara. In 1200 BCE, it's one of the largest cities in the world, home to perhaps 40,000 people and the center of an empire that stretches from the Aegean Sea to the Euphrates River. Picture approaching Hattusa on foot, as a Bronze Age visitor would have done. The city is built on a series of hills, its massive walls snaking across the landscape for over 6 kilometers. These aren't simple defensive barriers but architectural marvels, built of cyclopean stones fitted together without mortar, decorated with relief carvings of gods and kings. The most famous of these reliefs is the King's Gate, where a Hittite warrior god strides forward with sword raised, his muscled torso and determined expression carved with such skill that they seem ready to step off the stone and challenge any enemy. This is how the Hittites saw themselves, as divinely protected warriors, chosen by the gods to rule the civilized world. Inside the city, the royal archives contain one of the most important archaeological discoveries ever made for understanding the Bronze Age world. Thousands of cuneiform tablets baked hard when the palace burned preserve the diplomatic correspondence of Hittite kings with their contemporaries across the known world. These tablets mention Egypt's pharaohs, Assyrian kings, Babylonian rulers, and they also mention a place called Wilusa, with which the Hittites had treaty relationships. The Wilusa tablets describe a city that controlled important trade routes, had a king named Alexandu, very similar to Alexander, Paris's real name in some traditions, and was located in exactly the region where Troy stood. But the Hittite tablets reveal something else crucial to our story. The Bronze Age world was interconnected in ways that would put many modern international systems to shame. Kings exchanged letters regularly, negotiated complex treaties, arranged diplomatic marriages, and maintained trade relationships across thousands of miles. One tablet contains a letter from the Hittite king to the king of Ahiyawa, a land most scholars identify with Bronze Age Greece. The letter discusses territorial disputes, extradition of political refugees, and complaints about Ahiyawan raids on Hittite vassals. It's exactly the kind of diplomatic tension that could escalate into the kind of war Homer describes. Most tantalizingly, some tablets mention a troublemaker named Piyama Radu, who seems to have been raiding Hittite territory from a base somewhere in the west. Could this be a garbled memory of Priam, Troy's king? Could the Hittite archives preserve echoes of the very conflict Homer immortalized? Now let's return across the Aegean to the Greek world to understand the civilization that supposedly sent 1,000 ships to Troy's shores. The Greece of 1200 BCE bears little resemblance to the classical world of Pericles and Plato. This is a land of warrior kings ruling from massive stone fortresses, of palace bureaucracies that track every sheep and chariot wheel, of religious ceremonies that would seem utterly alien to later Greeks. Picture yourself approaching Mycenae, the greatest of these fortress cities, in the hour before dawn. The Argive plain stretches out below, dotted with small farming villages whose smoke rises straight up in the still morning air. Olive groves and grain fields checker the landscape, but your attention is drawn irresistibly upward to the massive walls that crown the hill above. The approach to Mycenae is deliberately intimidating. The path winds up the hillside, overlooked by watchtowers and guard posts, giving defenders multiple opportunities to rain arrows down on any attacking force. As you climb higher, the walls loom ever more massively above you, built of limestone blocks that weigh many tons each. And then you reach the Lion Gate, one of the most iconic monuments of the Bronze Age world. Two lions, carved in relief above the massive lintel stone, rear up on either side of a column that represents the palace within. Their heads, originally carved separately and attached with bronze pins, have long since fallen away, but their powerful bodies seem to guard the entrance with eternal vigilance. Passing through the gate, you enter a different world. The interior of the citadel is a maze of stone buildings, storerooms, workshops, and administrative quarters, all dominated by the Megaron, the great hall where the Wonax the king holds court and feast. The Megaron itself is a marvel of Bronze Age architecture, a massive rectangular hall with a central hearth where a fire burns day and night, surrounded by 4 columns that support the roof. The walls are decorated with frescoes showing scenes of war and hunting, religious ceremonies and courtly life. The floor is made of painted plaster, polished to a mirror shine. But what's most remarkable about the Mycenaean palaces isn't their architecture, it's their bureaucracy. These kings ruled through elaborate administrative systems that recorded everything in Linear B script. At Pylos, the archive contains tablets listing military equipment, so many chariots, so many bronze points for spears, so many helmets made of boar's tusks sewn onto leather caps. Other tablets record land tenure, with complex systems of plots held directly by the palace, plots given to officials as rewards for service, and plots held by local communities. The religious tablets list offerings to gods whose names we recognize from later Greek mythology: Poseidon, Zeus, Hera, Artemis, but also to deities whose names vanished when the Bronze Age ended. These tablets give us a vivid picture of Bronze Age Greek society. At the top, the Wonax, the king, whose authority comes directly from the gods. Below him, a hierarchy of officials: the Lauagetas, probably a military commander, the Telestai, landholders, and various palace bureaucrats. At the bottom, the common people, farmers, craftsmen, slaves, who supported the whole system with their labor. But the tablets also reveal a society under strain. Military preparations are everywhere in the final archive levels. Bronze is being collected and distributed for weapons. Coastal watchers are being posted to watch for enemy ships. Women and children from outlying areas are being moved to safety in the palace. Something was coming. The Bronze Age Greek world, like Troy across the sea, was preparing for war. And then, around 1200 BCE, it all ended. Palace after palace burned. The Linear B archives were baked into permanence by the fires that destroyed them. The elaborate bureaucratic systems collapsed. Literacy largely disappeared. The Bronze Age Greek world vanished into what historians call the Greek Dark Age, leaving only ruins and half-remembered songs about heroes and gods. So this was the world that existed when our story begins, a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the islands of the Aegean. A world of powerful kings and elaborate palaces, of international trade and diplomatic correspondence, of gods who spoke to mortals and heroes who could change the fate of nations. It was a world that knew it was living on borrowed time. The archaeological evidence shows preparations for war everywhere. In Troy's hastily strengthened defences, in the military preparations recorded in the Greek palace archives, in the general sense of impending crisis that marks the final Bronze Age levels at sites across the eastern Mediterranean. But how did this sophisticated, interconnected Bronze Age world collapse into the legendary conflict that Homer would immortalize? How did diplomatic tensions between Hittite vassals and Mycenaean raiders escalate into the war that would destroy Troy and doom the Greek world to centuries of darkness? To understand that, we need to delve into the realm of myth and legend, where gods walk among mortals and a single moment of divine judgment can reshape the destiny of nations. We need to go back to the beginning, to a wedding feast on Mount Pelion, a golden apple inscribed with 3 words, and a shepherd prince whose choice would doom 2 civilizations. We need to hear the story of the judgment of Paris, a tale that might preserve beneath its mythological surface memories of real Bronze Age politics, real royal marriages, and real diplomatic crises that tore the ancient world apart. Our story begins with a wedding that was both a celebration and a catastrophe, a moment when the divine and mortal worlds intersected with consequences that would echo through generations. It's the marriage of Thetis, a sea goddess whose very name means disposer, one who determines fate itself, to Peleus, a mortal hero whose bloodline would produce the greatest warrior the world had ever known. Close your eyes and travel back to Mount Pelion in Thessaly, northern Greece, on a perfect summer day sometime in the generation before the Trojan War. This is the home of Chiron, the wise centaur who teaches heroes their craft, and today it's been transformed into a venue fit for the wedding of the age. The mountain slopes are covered with flowers that never fade, fruit trees that bear every season, and springs that flow with wine instead of water, for when gods attend a wedding, nature itself celebrates. The guest list reads like a who's who of the ancient world's divine and heroic elite. Zeus himself presides, his presence felt in the rolling thunder that echoes from the peak even though no storm clouds mar the crystal blue sky. Hera, queen of the gods, attends in robes that shimmer with starlight. Athena comes bearing gifts of wisdom and warfare. Apollo brings his golden lyre, and his music makes the very stones dance. Artemis arrives with her silver bow, followed by a hunting party of nymphs whose laughter sounds like birdsong. But this wedding is more than a social event. It's a political necessity that reveals the power dynamics of the mythological world. Thetis, according to prophecy, is destined to bear a son who will be greater than his father. If Zeus had married her himself, their child might have overthrown him, just as Zeus had overthrown his own father Kronos. If Poseidon had claimed her, the son might have ruled both sea and sky. So the gods arranged for Thetis to marry a mortal, not just any mortal, but Peleus, king of the Myrmidons in Thessaly, a hero whose bloodline was already distinguished, but whose mortality guaranteed that his son, however great, could never threaten the divine order. The marriage ceremony itself blends divine and mortal customs in ways that reveal Bronze Age marriage practices. There's the exchange of gifts that creates kinship bonds, gold from Zeus, weapons from Ares, prophecy from Apollo. There's the ritual sharing of nectar and ambrosia that temporarily makes Peleus immortal for the ceremony. And there's the wedding song performed by the muses themselves that tells the story of great deeds yet to come. But even as the muses sing of glory and heroism, their song carries undertones of tragedy. They prophesy that Thetis will bear a son whose fame will outshine his father's, whose prowess in battle will be unmatched, but whose life will be brief as a summer flower. The child of this wedding will have to choose between a long, obscure life and a short, glorious death that wins immortal fame. Thetis herself knows this prophecy, and as she sits in her wedding robes of sea foam and silver, she's torn between joy at her marriage and grief for the son she hasn't yet born. The ancient sources, particularly in the fragments of the Cypria, describe her weeping tears that turn to pearls as they fall, knowing that she's giving birth to glory and doom in equal measure. But there's one goddess who watches these festivities from afar, uninvited and unremembered until she chooses to make her presence known. Eris, strife personified, discord herself, the sister of Ares who feeds on conflict and grows strong from the hatred between mortals and immortals alike. According to the Cypria and later sources like Apollodorus's library, Eris was deliberately excluded from the wedding invitation list. This wasn't simple oversight. In the Bronze Age world, both mortal and divine, some forces were too dangerous to invite to celebrations. Eris represented the chaos that could tear apart the careful alliances and obligations that held society together. Picture her approach. A figure cloaked in shadows that shift and writhe like living things, her face beautiful and terrible by turns, her eyes reflecting not light but the flames of burning cities. Where her feet touch the earth, flowers wither and grass turns brown. The very air around her tastes of copper and ash, the flavour of blood and ruin. She arrives at the wedding feast just as the celebrations are reaching their peak. Zeus has just toasted the happy couple, the muses have finished their prophetic song, and the assembled gods and heroes are beginning to relax into the kind of divine revelry that might last for days without pause. Without a word, Eris produces from the folds of her dark robe a golden apple. Not ordinary gold, but the metal of the gods themselves, warm to the touch and seeming to glow with its own internal light. Carved into its perfect surface, in letters that burn with divine fire, are three simple words: Te Kaliste, to the most beautiful. She throws it into the centre of the wedding feast and vanishes, leaving behind only the sound of bitter laughter that echoes from the mountainsides like the cry of ravens over a battlefield. The apple rolls across the floor, coming to rest at the feet of three goddesses, each of whom immediately claims it as rightfully hers. Hera, queen of the gods, whose beauty is matched only by her authority. Athena, whose grey eyes reflect the wisdom of ages and whose strategic mind has never known defeat. And Aphrodite, whose beauty has launched 100 wars and whose power over love and desire makes mortals and immortals alike helpless before her will. The contest that follows reveals not just divine vanity, but the fundamental forces that drive both mythological and historical conflict. Each goddess represents a different aspect of power, and each has legitimate claim to supreme beauty in her own sphere. Hera's argument isn't just about physical appearance, it's about cosmic order. She is Zeus's wife, queen of Olympus, protector of marriage and legitimate authority. Her beauty is that of sovereignty itself, the terrible loveliness of unchallenged power. When she speaks, her voice carries the weight of divine law. I am the wife of Zeus, ruler of all gods and mortals. No goddess outranks me, and therefore none can be more beautiful. In the Bronze Age world, beauty and power were inseparable. The most beautiful was, by definition, the most deserving of honour and worship. To be queen of the gods and not be judged most beautiful would undermine the entire divine hierarchy. Athena's response reveals a different understanding of beauty, the aesthetic of perfect function, of wisdom made manifest in action. Her grey eyes flash with strategic intelligence as she counters, "Beauty without wisdom is meaningless. I am the mind of Zeus made manifest, the goddess who brings victory in war and skill in craft. My beauty is that of perfect knowledge perfectly applied." In the fragments of the Cypria, Athena's argument is more elaborate. She points out that she was born from Zeus's head, making her literally the embodiment of divine wisdom. She argues that true beauty lies in excellence, arete, and that she, as the goddess who grants skill to craftsmen and victory to warriors, is the source of all human achievement. But Aphrodite's claim cuts deeper than politics or wisdom. Her beauty is primal, biological, the force that drives all living things to reproduce and continue the cosmic cycle. When she speaks, her voice carries the promise of every love song ever sung and the threat of every heart ever broken. Without me, there would be no marriage to protect, no children to teach wisdom, no reason for mortals to create anything worth achieving. I am the force that moves the world. Aphrodite's argument, preserved in various sources, reveals sophisticated understanding of what we might call evolutionary psychology. She claims that beauty itself exists because of the drive to attract mates and reproduce. Every other form of beauty, artistic, intellectual, political, derives from this basic biological imperative. The contest threatens to tear apart the wedding feast and, more seriously, the divine order itself. When gods argue, the mortal world suffers the consequences. Zeus knows this, and he knows he cannot judge between his wife, his daughter, and the force that makes existence itself meaningful. Zeus's solution reveals the political sophistication of Bronze Age myth-making. Rather than judge the contest himself and create permanent enemies among the three most powerful goddesses, he defers the judgment to a mortal, someone whose decision cannot be seen as expressing divine favoritism. The mortal chosen is Paris, son of King Priam of Troy, though at this moment he knows nothing of his royal heritage. The story of Paris's childhood, preserved in the Cypria and elaborated by later sources like Apollodorus, reads like a Bronze Age political thriller. When Paris was born, his mother, Queen Hecuba, experienced prophetic dreams that terrified the entire royal court. In one dream, she gave birth not to a child, but to a flaming torch that set all of Troy ablaze. In another, she delivered a 100-headed serpent that devoured the city's defenders. The court prophets, led by Asaicus, who may be a garbled memory of the historical Trojan priest Asarchos, interpreted these dreams as warnings that the child would bring destruction to Troy. King Priam faced the terrible choice that haunts Bronze Age royal families: kill his own son to protect his kingdom, or spare the child and risk everything he'd built. Political reality won. Priam ordered the infant exposed on Mount Ida, the forested peak that rises above Troy, where wild animals or exposure would quickly end the threat. But Paris survived, rescued by shepherds who found the abandoned baby and raised him as their own. He grew up as Alexandros, his birth name, meaning defender of men, in the pastoral world of the Idaean hills, learning to tend flocks, track wild animals, and judge disputes between his fellow herders. The young Paris becomes famous throughout the region for his beauty, his fairness in judgment, and his skill in the contests of strength and speed that punctuate the shepherd's year. When bulls fight over leadership of the herders bring their disputes to Paris for resolution. When neighboring communities argue over grazing rights or water access, they accept Paris's judgment as final. It's this reputation for fairness that brings him to the attention of Hermes, Zeus's messenger, who appears to the young shepherd in the form of a traveler seeking directions. But Hermes is really assessing Paris's character, determining whether this mortal judge can handle a case that will determine the fate of gods and mortals alike. The test comes when Hermes observes Paris judging a contest between his own prize bull and a magnificent wild bull that has appeared from nowhere. Unknown to Paris, the wild bull is actually Ares in disguise, sent by Zeus to test the young man's integrity. When the divine bull clearly wins the contest, Paris awards it the prize despite his personal loss, proving his commitment to justice over self-interest. Satisfied that he's found a judge who will decide based on merit rather than favoritism, Hermes reveals his divine nature and explains the task ahead. Paris must choose which of three goddesses, Hera, Athena, or Aphrodite, deserves the golden apple inscribed to the most beautiful. As Hermes speaks, the very air around them shimmers with divine power. The pastoral hillside of Mount Ida transforms into a cosmic courtroom where the fate of gods and mortals will be decided by a shepherd prince who doesn't yet know he's the son of a king. Picture the scene: Mount Ida at high noon, when the sun stands directly overhead and casts no shadows. The shepherd Paris stands in a grove of oak trees sacred to Zeus, while before him materialize three figures of such beauty and power that mortal eyes can barely comprehend them. Each goddess appears in her full divine glory, yet carefully tempered so that a mortal man can look upon them without being destroyed by the sight. Hera appears first, and her presence transforms the grove into a throne room worthy of the queen of the gods. Golden light radiates from her tall, regal form, and her dark hair is crowned with a diadem that seems to be made of crystallized starlight. Her robes shift color like silk, shot through with precious metals, now deep purple, now burning gold, now silver like moonlight on water. When she speaks, her voice carries the authority of cosmic law itself. Paris of Troy, she begins, and her use of his true heritage, unknown to him but not to her divine sight, sends a chill through the young shepherd. Look upon me, and know that I am Hera, queen of Olympus, protector of marriage, guardian of legitimate authority. I am the force that brings order to chaos, that makes kings out of mortals and ensures that power serves justice rather than mere appetite. Her beauty, as she reveals it to Paris, is the terrible loveliness of absolute authority. Her eyes reflect the wisdom of ages, her bearing speaks of unquestioned command, and her very presence makes Paris understand what it means to rule by divine right. This isn't the beauty of youth or sensuality, but the deeper aesthetic of perfect order, of a cosmos where every element serves its proper function. Choose me, Hera continues, and I will make you lord of all Asia and Europe. Every kingdom from the rising to the setting sun will acknowledge your authority. You will rule not as a petty king over a single city, but as emperor of the known world. Your name will be remembered as long as mortals speak of power and glory. Her bribe isn't just political, it's cosmic. She's offering Paris the chance to become the earthly representative of divine order, to rule the world as she rules Olympus. In Bronze Age terms, this means recognition by every major king from Egypt to Babylon, marriage alliances that would make Troy the center of international diplomacy, and wealth beyond calculation from tribute and trade. Athena appears next, and her manifestation is very different. Where Hera radiates authority, Athena embodies capability. Her grey eyes, Homer's constant epithet for her, seem to see through everything, analyzing, evaluating, understanding the perfect move in every situation. Her armor gleams with mirror brightness, but it's functional rather than decorative, every piece designed for maximum effectiveness. Her aegis, the magical shield bearing the head of Medusa, seems to shift and move with its own life. Paris Alexandros, she says, using both his names to show she understands all aspects of his nature. I am Athena, born from Zeus's head, the goddess who brings victory in war and excellence in peace. I am wisdom made manifest, strategy perfected, the divine mind that solves problems others cannot even comprehend. As she speaks, Paris suddenly understands things he'd never grasped before. Military tactics become crystal clear. He can see how to position archers for maximum effect, how to use terrain to turn enemy strength into weakness, how to inspire troops with words that turn cowards into heroes. Craftsmanship makes sense at a level he'd never imagined, the perfect way to forge bronze so it holds its edge, the ideal proportion for building walls that will stand for centuries, the mathematical principles that govern everything from navigation to architecture. Choose me, Athena offers, and I will make you the wisest of mortals and the greatest warrior who ever lived. You will never lose a battle, never make a mistake in judgment, never fail to find the solution to any problem. Kings will seek your counsel, craftsmen will study your techniques, and poets will sing of your perfect victories for 1,000 generations. Her beauty is the aesthetic of perfection itself, not just physical perfection, but the deeper beauty of mind and skill functioning at their absolute peak. She's offering Paris not just success but mastery, the chance to become the greatest human being who ever lived in terms of capability and achievement. But then Aphrodite appears, and everything changes. Where Hera was majestic and Athena was brilliant, Aphrodite is simply irresistible. Her beauty isn't superhuman but hyperhuman. She looks like what every mortal woman might become if raised to the perfect expression of femininity. Her golden hair moves in breezes that touch nothing else. Her skin glows with inner light, and her smile promises every joy that love can bring. "Paris, my beloved," she says, and her voice is like music that touches the soul directly, bypassing the mind entirely. "I am Aphrodite, born from the sea foam when Kronos' blood mixed with the waves. I am love and desire, the force that makes life worth living, the power that creates all beauty and joy in the world." As she speaks, Paris feels his heart racing not with fear but with longing. She shows him visions of what love can be, not just physical desire, but the deep connection between souls that makes mortals willing to die for each other, the inspiration that drives poets to create immortal art, the bond between husband and wife that creates families and continues the human race. "The other goddesses offer you power over things," Aphrodite continues, "but I offer you power over hearts. They promise you dominion over territories, but I promise you the love of the most beautiful woman ever born to mortal parents, Helen of Sparta, whose beauty makes men forget wisdom and kings abandon their thrones." Her description of Helen is intoxicating. According to the Cypria and other early sources, Helen is the daughter of Zeus himself, born when the king of gods took the form of a swan and seduced Leda, queen of Sparta. She inherited divine beauty in mortal form, making her literally the most beautiful woman who ever lived or ever could live. "Choose me," Aphrodite concludes, "and Helen will love you with the same passion that moves the stars in their courses. She will leave husband and home to be with you, and your love will become the greatest romance in mortal history. Poets will sing of your passion when the very stones of Troy have crumbled to dust." Paris stands in the grove, overwhelmed by the choice before him. Each goddess offers a different vision of the perfect life, a different understanding of what makes existence worthwhile. Hera promises power, the chance to rule the world and leave a legacy of order and justice. Athena offers excellence, the opportunity to become the greatest human being who ever lived in terms of capability and achievement. Aphrodite pledges love, the experience of perfect romantic union with the most beautiful woman in the world. The choice Paris faces isn't just personal preference, it's philosophical. He's choosing between different definitions of the good life, different values, different ways of understanding what makes human existence meaningful. And Paris chooses love. The moment Paris awards the golden apple to Aphrodite, his life changes irrevocably. The goddess's smile is radiant with triumph, but even as she grants him her divine favor, there's something ominous in the way Hera and Athena withdraw. They don't rage or threaten, they simply fade away like storms gathering on distant horizons, and Paris knows he's made enemies of forces beyond mortal comprehension. To understand how a personal dispute between Paris and Menelaus could escalate into a war that would destroy entire civilizations, we need to go back in time to Helen's original marriage, an event that was less a romantic union than a carefully orchestrated political summit that would reshape the balance of power in the Bronze Age Greek world. Picture Sparta 15 years before Paris's arrival, during the reign of Tyndareus, Helen's foster father and the man who raised her after Zeus's seduction of Leda. The palace is bustling with activity as never before, for Helen has reached marriageable age, and every eligible king in Greece has come to court the most beautiful woman ever born to mortal parents. The list of suitors reads like a catalogue of Bronze Age Greek royalty. From Mycenae comes Agamemnon, already the most powerful king in Greece, bringing gifts that would bankrupt lesser kingdoms: gold from Nubia, silver from Anatolia, horses from the steppes beyond the Black Sea. From Ithaca arrives young Odysseus, whose kingdom may be small, but whose reputation for cleverness has already spread across the civilized world. Ajax the Greater sails from Salamis with a fleet that demonstrates his island kingdom's naval power. His half-brother Teucer comes from the same expedition, renowned for his skill with the bow. From Argos arrives Diomedes, whose family has ruled there since the heroic age, bringing chariots and bronze armor that showcase his kingdom's military might. Patroclus comes from Opus, representing not just his own small kingdom, but his friendship with young Achilles, whose reputation as a warrior is already legendary despite his youth. Idomeneus arrives from Crete with ships loaded with the island's famous bronze work, demonstrating the wealth that flows through Minoan trading networks. From the north come the Thessalian princes, Protesilaus, Podarces, and others who control the horse-breeding regions that supply the finest cavalry mounts in the Greek world. From the Peloponnese arrive dozens of lesser kings and princes, each hoping that Helen's hand might elevate his status and secure his kingdom's future. But this gathering isn't just about romance, it's the most important political assembly in a generation. Each suitor represents not just himself, but a complex web of alliances, obligations, and territorial claims. Helen's marriage will determine not just who rules Sparta, but how power is distributed across the entire Greek world. Tyndareus understands this perfectly. As an experienced king who's survived decades of Bronze Age politics, he knows that choosing the wrong suitor could destabilize the entire region. Choose Agamemnon, and Mycenae becomes too powerful for any other kingdom to challenge. Choose one of the lesser kings, and Agamemnon might wage war to prevent a rival from gaining Sparta's resources. The problem is complicated by Helen's unique status. In some traditions, she's not just a princess, but the legitimate heir to Sparta's throne. The kingdom passes through the female line, and whoever marries her becomes king by right rather than by conquest. This makes the marriage not just a personal alliance, but a transfer of sovereignty. The solution comes from an unexpected source: Odysseus, who may not be the most powerful suitor, but who's certainly the cleverest. According to sources like Apollodorus and Hyginus, Odysseus approaches Tyndareus privately with a proposal. Instead of choosing a suitor based on wealth or power, let Helen herself choose whom she loves. But before the choice is announced, require all the suitors to swear an oath. They will respect Helen's decision and defend her chosen husband against anyone who wrongs him regarding the marriage. Tyndareus immediately sees the brilliance of this solution. By letting Helen choose freely, he avoids making enemies of the rejected suitors. By requiring the oath, he ensures that Helen's marriage will be protected by every major king in Greece. Instead of creating one powerful alliance and many enemies, he's binding the entire Greek world together in a mutual defense pact. The oath-taking ceremony takes place in Sparta's most sacred location, the shrine of Artemis Orthia, where the goddess is honored in her aspect as protector of young women and guardian of marriage vows. The setting itself reinforces the religious significance of what's about to happen. These aren't just political promises but sacred commitments witnessed by the gods themselves. The ritual follows Bronze Age protocols that are designed to make oath-breaking literally unthinkable. Each suitor places his hand on the sacred objects while speaking the binding words. A bronze sword representing the military force that will punish oath-breakers, a golden cup representing the prosperity that comes from keeping faith, and a stone from Mount Olympus representing the divine authority that sanctions all legitimate oaths. The words of the oath, preserved in various forms by later sources, bind each suitor to specific obligations. I swear by Zeus, the king of gods, by Poseidon the earth shaker, by Apollo the far shooter, that I will defend the man whom Helen chooses as her husband against any who wrong him regarding this marriage. I will bring my armies and my ships to his aid, no matter how distant the enemy or how long the campaign. I will count his enemies as my enemies, his cause as my cause, until justice is satisfied and the wrong is made right. The oath is deliberately comprehensive, designed to cover any possible threat to Helen's marriage. It doesn't just promise aid against rival suitors, but against anyone who might harm the marriage relationship, whether by seduction, abduction, or political interference. More importantly, the oath creates what modern political scientists would recognize as a collective security agreement. Each king is promising not just to help Helen's husband individually, but to join a coalition with all the other oath-takers. This means that anyone who violates Helen's marriage will face not just one enemy kingdom, but the combined might of the entire Greek world. After each king has sworn the oath individually, they perform a group ritual that seals their collective commitment. A white bull, the most sacred offering possible, is sacrificed to Zeus. Its blood is mixed with wine and poured out on the altar while all the suitors join in a prayer asking the gods to witness their promises and punish any who break faith. The ceremony concludes with a feast that lasts 3 days, during which the oaths are formally recorded by palace scribes and copies are sent to the major temples throughout Greece. This ensures that the commitment becomes not just personal but institutional. Even if individual kings die or change their minds, their successors will be bound by the recorded oaths. With the oath-taking complete, attention turns to Helen herself. The sources disagree about her motivations. Some suggest she was genuinely attracted to Menelaus, others that she was influenced by political considerations, still others that divine intervention guided her choice. What's clear is that her decision surprises many of the assembled suitors. Menelaus isn't the most powerful candidate. That would be his brother Agamemnon. He's not the cleverest. Odysseus holds that distinction. He's not the most famous warrior. Ajax or Diomedes would have stronger claims there. But Menelaus offers something that the others don't. He's Agamemnon's younger brother, which means Helen's marriage will create an alliance with Mycenae without making Sparta subordinate to it. He's wealthy enough to maintain royal status, but not so powerful as to overshadow Helen herself. And personally, he seems to genuinely care for Helen as a person, rather than simply coveting her political value. Helen's announcement is made publicly, in the same shrine where the oaths were sworn. She places a golden wreath on Menelaus's head while declaring, "Before gods and mortals, I choose Menelaus of Sparta as my husband and king. Let all who have sworn oaths here remember their promises, and let the gods bless our union with happiness and prosperity." The celebration that follows is magnificent even by Bronze Age royal standards. Each rejected suitor offers gifts to the happy couple, not just from courtesy, but as public acknowledgement of Helen's choice and their acceptance of it. The gift-giving creates reciprocal obligations that will reinforce the original oath. By accepting these treasures, Menelaus binds himself to honor the givers as friends and allies. The wedding itself takes place a month later, allowing time for proper preparations and for more distant guests to arrive. The ceremony blends Greek and Spartan traditions with innovations designed to emphasize the political significance of the union. But even as the celebrations reach their peak, thoughtful observers notice omens that suggest trouble ahead. Birds of prey circle overhead during the outdoor ceremonies. The sacrificial victims show signs that the seers interpret as warnings of future conflict, and Helen herself, despite her apparent happiness, sometimes seems distracted, as if she's seeing visions of a different future. 15 years later, when Menelaus returns from Crete to find Helen gone and his palace ransacked, his first emotion isn't grief, but rage. Paris hasn't just violated the sacred laws of hospitality, he's triggered the most important military alliance in the Bronze Age Greek world. Within hours of discovering Helen's absence, Menelaus sends messengers racing across Greece with identical messages for every king who swore the oath at Sparta. The message is brief, but legally precise. Menelaus, son of Atreus, king of Sparta, by right of marriage to Helen, daughter of Zeus, calls upon the oaths sworn in the shrine of Artemis Orthia. Paris of Troy has violated the sacred bond of hospitality and stolen the queen of Sparta. Justice demands vengeance, and the gods require satisfaction. Honor your oaths. Gather your armies. The time for war has come. The response is immediate and overwhelming. Every king who swore the oath begins mobilizing his forces, not because they necessarily care about Menelaus personally, but because they understand that oath-breaking threatens the entire system of Bronze Age diplomacy. If sacred promises can be ignored without consequences, then no alliance is secure, no treaty is binding, and international relations will collapse into chaos. From Mycenae, Agamemnon sends word that he's assuming command of the expedition, not just as Menelaus's brother, but as the most powerful king in Greece and the one with the most resources to organize a campaign against Troy. His message is characteristically direct. "I will lead this war, and I will see Troy burned to ashes for this insult to our family and our honor." From Ithaca, Odysseus responds with apparent reluctance. He's recently married and has a newborn son, Telemachus, whom he's reluctant to leave. But the oath is binding, and his message acknowledges this. "I will honor my commitment, though it tears my heart to leave my family. Let the ships be prepared and the armies gathered." Ajax sends word from Salamis that his fleet is already being prepared. Diomedes responds from Argos that his warriors are eager for the campaign. From across Greece, the responses pour in. Idomeneus will bring the Cretan fleet. Patroclus will represent Achilles' interests. The Thessalian princes will provide cavalry and naval support. But the most crucial response comes from Phthia in northern Greece, where young Achilles rules the Myrmidons. His answer is brief but decisive. "I will come, and I will bring glory to this war that will be remembered for 1,000 generations." Within months, the greatest military force ever assembled in the Bronze Age world is gathering at Aulis, the sacred harbour from which the expedition will sail to Troy. Over 1,000 ships, according to Homer's famous catalogue, carrying the elite warriors of dozens of kingdoms. The Oath of Tyndareus has created exactly what it was designed to create, a coalition so powerful that no enemy could hope to resist it. But as we'll see, creating a coalition and using it effectively are very different challenges. The kings who gather at Aulis bring not just their armies but their personal ambitions, their rivalries, and their very different ideas about how the war should be fought. The greatest military expedition in ancient history is about to set sail for Troy. But first, the gods will demand a price that will test the coalition's unity and foreshadow the tragedies to come. Picture the harbour at Aulis on a late spring morning in 1194 BCE. The sun rises over the Aegean Sea, casting long shadows across what has become the largest military assembly point in the Bronze Age world. Where once there was only a small fishing harbour with a few beached boats and nets drying in the sun, now stretches a fleet so vast that it seems to cover the entire bay. Over 1,000 ships bob at anchor or rest on the beaches, their black hulls gleaming with fresh pitch, their bronze-fitted rams catching the morning light like the fangs of sea monsters. These aren't just transportation vessels, but floating fortresses, each one carrying between 20 and 50 of the finest warriors in the Greek world, along with their weapons, armour, supplies, and the material wealth needed to sustain a campaign in hostile territory. But as the days pass and the fleet remains assembled at Aulis, it becomes clear that something is wrong. The winds that should carry the ships toward Troy simply refuse to blow. Day after day, the sea remains flat calm, its surface like polished bronze reflecting the cloudless sky. The weather is perfect for sailing, except that there's no wind to fill the sails. At first, the delay seems like a minor inconvenience. The commanders use the time to finalize their plans, conduct additional training exercises, and address the logistical challenges of moving such a large force across hostile waters. Priests perform daily sacrifices, asking the gods for favorable winds and seeking omens about the campaign's prospects. But as days turn into weeks, and weeks stretch toward months, the supernatural nature of the calm becomes undeniable. This isn't normal weather, it's divine intervention, and everyone in the expedition knows it. The question is, which god is responsible, and what do they want? The answer comes from Calchas, the expedition's chief prophet, a man whose ability to read divine will in the flight of birds, the behavior of sacrificial animals, and the patterns of wind and wave has never been questioned. After consulting all his arts of divination, Calchas requests a private meeting with Agamemnon and the other senior commanders. Calchas's revelation is devastating. The goddess Artemis is responsible for the calm, and she's angry with Agamemnon personally. According to the prophet, the king has somehow offended the virgin goddess of the hunt, and she will not allow the expedition to sail until proper atonement is made. The sources disagree about exactly what Agamemnon did to anger Artemis. Some versions suggest he boasted that he was a better hunter than the goddess herself after successfully killing a sacred deer. Others claim he promised to sacrifice to Artemis the most beautiful thing born in the year of his daughter Iphigenia's birth, then failed to keep his vow when she turned out to be that most beautiful thing. But all sources agree on what Calchas says is required for atonement. Agamemnon must sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia to Artemis. Only the death of what he loves most will satisfy the goddess's anger and allow the winds to blow. The demand places Agamemnon in an impossible position that reveals the fundamental tensions at the heart of Bronze Age heroic culture. As a king, his primary obligation is to his people and his allies. The 1,000 ships at Aulis represent not just his own ambitions but the sworn commitments of dozens of kingdoms. If the expedition fails because he refuses to make the required sacrifice, he betrays every oath-bound ally who answered his call. As a father, however, his duty is to protect his children, especially his daughters, whose safety and honour reflect directly on his ability to maintain his household. Iphigenia isn't just his beloved child but a princess whose value lies partly in the advantageous marriage alliances she might create. Killing her destroys not just her life but her potential political usefulness to the royal family. The pressure from his allies is enormous and relentless. Menelaus argues that the expedition's failure would make his wife's abduction meaningless and destroy his honor permanently. Odysseus, with his characteristic cleverness, points out the practical consequences. If word spreads that the Greek coalition disbanded because Agamemnon wouldn't fulfill his religious obligations, every enemy of Greece will be emboldened to attack, knowing that the Greeks can't maintain unity in crisis. Ajax approaches the question from a warrior's perspective. The army is ready for battle, the ships are prepared, the gods have been invoked. Backing down now would be cowardice and would invite divine punishment for oath-breaking. Diomedes adds that the younger generation of warriors has come to Aulis specifically to prove themselves in the greatest war of their age, denying them that opportunity would betray their trust and ambition. But perhaps the most compelling argument comes from Calchas himself, who reminds Agamemnon that kings rule by divine favor. If he refuses to obey Artemis's clear command, he risks not just the failure of this expedition but the loss of divine support for his entire reign. The gods who have granted him power can just as easily take it away if he proves unworthy of their trust. The debate continues for days, with different commanders and advisors pressing their cases in private meetings and public assemblies. The army begins to grow restless as rumors spread about the reason for the delay. Some soldiers talk about returning home, others about choosing a new leader who won't hesitate to do what the gods require. Finally, Agamemnon makes his choice, the choice that will define his character for the rest of the war and echo through centuries of literature as an example of the terrible prices that power sometimes demands. Unable to bring himself to tell Iphigenia directly about her fate, Agamemnon devises a deception that adds betrayal to the already terrible act of sacrifice. He sends word to his wife Clytemnestra in Mycenae, claiming that Achilles has asked for Iphigenia's hand in marriage and wants the wedding to take place immediately at Aulis, before the expedition sails. The message is carefully crafted to seem believable. Achilles is indeed the most eligible young hero in the expedition, and marrying him would be a tremendous honor for any royal family. The urgency makes sense given the military situation, and holding the wedding at Aulis would allow all the great kings of Greece to attend, making it a magnificent celebration. Clytemnestra's response is immediate and joyful. She sets out from Mycenae with Iphigenia and a full royal retinue, bringing wedding gifts, ceremonial robes, and all the preparations for a celebration that will never happen. The journey to Aulis becomes a triumphal procession, with mother and daughter discussing Iphigenia's future with Achilles and the honored position she'll hold as wife to the greatest warrior of their generation. The moment of revelation, when Clytemnestra and Iphigenia arrive at Aulis and learn the truth, is one of the most heart-wrenching scenes in all ancient literature. Different sources handle it differently. Some have Agamemnon tell them directly, others have them discover the truth gradually. Still others have Achilles himself reveal the deception when he learns how his name has been used. But all sources agree on the devastating impact. Clytemnestra's joy turns to fury as she realizes her husband has betrayed not just their daughter, but their marriage itself. Iphigenia's excitement about her wedding becomes terror as she understands that she's been brought to Aulis not as a bride but as a sacrificial victim. The sacrifice itself takes place at dawn, at an altar specially constructed for Artemis near the harbour where the goddess can see the fleet she's been holding hostage. The details vary among sources. Some have Iphigenia accepting her fate bravely, others show her pleading for life. Still others suggest divine intervention that substitutes a deer at the last moment. But the immediate result is always the same. As Iphigenia's blood flows over the altar, the winds begin to blow, and so the fleet finally sails from Aulis, carried by winds purchased with royal blood. But the price of divine favour has created wounds within the Greek coalition that will never fully heal. Clytemnestra returns to Mycenae nursing a hatred for her husband that will eventually destroy their marriage and their house. Achilles, discovering how his name was used in the deception, develops a mistrust of authority that will shape his actions throughout the war. Most ominously, the precedent has been set. When victory requires it, the Greek leadership will sacrifice anything, or anyone, to achieve their goals. This willingness to pay any price for success will define their conduct of the war and ultimately contribute to their own destruction. But for now, as the black ships spread their sails and turn toward Troy, all thoughts focus on the glorious campaign ahead. The greatest army in history is finally moving toward its destiny, carrying with it the hopes and ambitions of an entire civilization. The winds that Artemis has finally granted will carry them across the wine-dark sea to the coast of Troy, where they'll establish a beachhead and begin the siege that will last 10 years and end in the destruction of 2 civilizations. The Trojan War has begun. For 3 days and 2 nights, the greatest fleet in Bronze Age history cuts through the wine-dark waters of the Aegean Sea, driven by winds that carry not just ships but the accumulated hopes, fears and ambitions of an entire civilization. Picture this armada from the perspective of the sea itself, over 1,000 black hulls stretched across miles of blue water, their bronze-fitted rams gleaming like the teeth of sea monsters, their linen sails billowing white against the endless sky. The formation is both practical and symbolic. At the center sail the command vessels of the greatest kings, Agamemnon's flagship with its lion-headed prow, Menelaus's ship decorated with silver inlays that catch the sunlight, Odysseus's distinctive vessel with its painted eyes that seem to watch the horizon for danger. These ships carry not just their royal commanders, but the portable treasures, ceremonial weapons, and diplomatic gifts that will be needed for conducting war far from home. Radiating outward from this royal core, the fleet arranges itself by kingdom and alliance. The Mycenaean contingent holds the center right, their ships easily recognizable by their uniform black hulls and the standardized bronze fittings that speak of centralized manufacturing. To their left sail the Spartan vessels, fewer in number but each one a masterpiece of naval engineering, built for speed and maneuverability rather than mass intimidation. The Athenian squadron maintains tight formation on the fleet's left wing, their ships smaller than the Mycenaean galleys but more maneuverable, designed by naval architects who understand that victories at sea come from superior seamanship rather than brute force. Their crews are the most experienced sailors in the expedition, men who've spent their lives navigating the treacherous waters around Attica's rocky coastline. From the islands come the maritime specialists, Cretan ships with their distinctive curved prows, Rhodian vessels built for long-distance trading, and the swift galleys of Salamis that serve as scouts and messengers for the main fleet. These crews know every current and wind pattern in the Aegean, every safe harbour and dangerous reef between Greece and Troy. But perhaps most impressive are the northern contingents, the Thessalian ships carrying not just warriors but the hundreds of horses that will give the Greek army its cavalry arm. These vessels have been specially modified with reinforced decks and elaborate systems of ropes and pulleys for loading and unloading the animals. The horses themselves, bred in the rich pastures of northern Greece, represent a significant tactical advantage over any enemy that lacks mounted forces. As the fleet moves steadily northeast toward the Hellespont, the daily routines of naval life establish themselves. Each morning begins before dawn with sacrifice and divination. Priests on every major vessel consulting the omens to ensure continued divine favour. The sacrifice of wine poured into the sea, the burning of incense whose smoke is red for prophetic meaning, the observation of bird flight and weather patterns that might indicate the god's will. The breakfast that follows is simple but carefully managed. Barley bread baked in portable ovens, dried fish and olives that keep well at sea, wine mixed with water in proper proportions. Food on a naval expedition is always precious, and strict rationing ensures that supplies last until the army can establish secure bases on enemy territory. During the day, training continues even aboard ship. Archers practice their aim by shooting at targets thrown from the bow, while spearmen work on their balance and throwing technique despite the rolling deck. Officers move between ships in small boats, coordinating plans and maintaining the communication that holds such a large force together. But the most crucial daily activity is navigation. Without the compass or accurate maps, Bronze Age sailing depends on experienced pilots who read the stars, the wind patterns, the colour and movement of the water itself. The course toward Troy requires precise coordination to avoid the rocky islands and treacherous currents that could destroy individual ships or scatter the entire fleet. As the second day progresses, the mountains of Troy's homeland begin to appear on the horizon. First as a faint blue line, then as distinct peaks that promise landfall. Mount Ida rises highest, its forested slopes clearly visible, while to the north the entrance to the Hellespont appears as a narrow gap between the Asian and European shores. But as the fleet approaches enemy waters, the mood changes from anticipation to tension. These aren't friendly shores they're approaching, but hostile territory where every beach might conceal an ambush, every harbour might shelter enemy warships. The formation tightens as scouts race ahead to examine potential landing sites and watch for Trojan naval forces. Meanwhile, on the windswept walls of Troy, watchmen who have been scanning the horizon for days finally see what they've been dreading. The dark line of the Greek fleet approaching from the southwest like a storm cloud spreading across the sea. The signal fires that have been prepared for this moment burst into flame, sending smoke columns skyward that will be visible from every town and village in the Troad. Within minutes, the great bronze bell in Troy's citadel begins to toll, its deep voice carrying across the city and the surrounding plain, calling every able-bodied man to his designated position in the defense plan that has been refined over months of preparation. The sound echoes from the stone walls and buildings, creating a bronze chorus that speaks of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. King Priam, despite his advanced age, climbs to the highest tower of his palace, his weathered hands gripping the bronze-fitted staff that marks his royal authority. From this vantage point, he can see the full scope of the approaching threat, more ships than anyone has ever imagined assembled for a single campaign, carrying an army that outnumbers Troy's entire population, including women, children, and slaves. Beside him stands his eldest son, Hector, crown prince and commander of Troy's military forces, his bronze armour already strapped in place, his famous spear, the one that never misses its target, held ready in his strong right hand. Hector's face is grim as he studies the approaching fleet, calculating numbers, estimating the enemy's strength, planning the defence that will determine whether Troy survives or falls. "Father," Hector says, his voice carrying the authority of a man who's spent years preparing for this moment. "They're more numerous than our worst estimates suggested, but numbers aren't everything. They'll have to come ashore somewhere, and when they do, we'll be waiting." The defence plan that Hector has developed over the winter months is sophisticated by Bronze Age standards. Rather than trying to defend the entire coastline, an impossible task given Troy's limited manpower, he's concentrated his forces at the most likely landing sites, prepared mobile reserves that can respond quickly to wherever the Greeks actually come ashore, and established signal systems that will allow rapid communication across the battlefield. The Trojan army assembles with the efficiency that comes from months of drilling. Heavy infantry takes position behind portable shields made from multiple layers of bull's hide reinforced with bronze studs. Their long spears, designed specifically for stopping cavalry charges and infantry assaults, form a bristling hedge of bronze points that can cut down attackers before they reach hand-to-hand range. Archers position themselves on elevated ground where they can shoot over the heads of their own infantry while remaining protected from enemy arrows. Their composite bows, made from layers of horn, wood and sinew, can drive arrows through bronze armour at ranges that will surprise the Greeks, who are accustomed to facing opponents with inferior missile weapons. But Troy's greatest advantage isn't its army, it's the alliance system that Priam has spent decades building. As the signal fires spread the news of the Greek landing, contingents of allied forces begin converging on the city from across Anatolia and beyond. From the north come Thracian cavalry, their horses bred for speed and their riders skilled with javelin and sword. From the east arrive Lycian allies led by Sarpedon and Glaucus, warriors whose reputation for courage matches that of the Greeks themselves. The Dardanians send their prince Aeneas, son of Aphrodite according to legend, leading troops whose knowledge of the local terrain will prove invaluable in the coming campaign. From distant Ethiopia comes Memnon with his exotic warriors, bringing weapons and tactics that the Greeks have never encountered. Most importantly, Troy's wealth allows Priam to hire mercenary specialists from across the known world. Scythian horse archers whose mobility and firepower can harass enemy formations without engaging in costly direct combat. Engineers from Mesopotamia who understand the latest techniques in fortification and siege warfare, even Celtic warriors from the distant west whose iron weapons and berserker tactics create fear in enemies accustomed to more civilized forms of combat. The Greek fleet chooses to land at a stretch of beach about 5 miles south of Troy, where the coastline is relatively flat and the water deep enough for their ships to approach close to shore. It's an obvious choice tactically, the best available landing site, but that also means the Trojans have anticipated it and prepared their defences accordingly. As the first Greek ships ground themselves on the sandy beach, Trojan forces emerge from concealed positions among the dunes and sparse vegetation behind the shore. The ambush is perfectly timed. The Greeks are at their most vulnerable, caught between the sea and an enemy that knows the terrain perfectly. The first man to leap from a Greek ship onto Trojan soil is Protesilaus of Phyllis, according to the ancient tradition. His act of heroism, being first to set foot on enemy territory, is also an act of doom, for the oracles have prophesied that the first Greek to land at Troy will be the first to die. Even as Protesilaus splashes through the shallow water with spear raised and battle cry echoing across the beach, Trojan javelins are already in the air. Hector himself leads the counterattack, his bronze-tipped spear flashing in the morning sunlight as he cuts down Greek warriors who are still struggling to organize themselves on the unfamiliar shore. His famous war cry, "For Troy and sacred Ilios," rallies the Trojan forces and strikes fear into enemies who have heard of his prowess but never faced it directly. The battle for the beachhead becomes a chaotic melee of individual combats and small unit actions. Greek ships continue to arrive and discharge their warriors, but the men coming ashore find themselves immediately engaged in desperate hand-to-hand fighting. The sandy beach becomes slippery with blood as warriors from both sides fall, their bronze armor offering little protection against spear thrusts and sword cuts delivered at close range. But the Greeks have advantages beyond mere numbers. Achilles, leaping from his ship with the Myrmidons behind him, immediately establishes himself as a force of nature on the battlefield. His bronze-tipped spear, inherited from his father Peleus and blessed by the gods themselves, seems to find its target with supernatural accuracy. Every thrust kills or maims, every movement flows with deadly grace that makes ordinary warriors look clumsy by comparison. Ajax the Greater wades into combat like a walking fortress, his massive shield deflecting Trojan spears while his sword cuts down enemies who can't reach him through his defensive perimeter. His sheer physical presence, he stands head and shoulders above ordinary men, creates space for other Greeks to establish their own footholds on the beach. Diomedes coordinates a flanking movement that catches the Trojan left wing by surprise, his Argive warriors advancing in disciplined formation while maintaining their shield wall against enemy missiles. This kind of tactical sophistication gives the Greeks a crucial advantage over enemies who are fighting more as individual heroes than as coordinated military units. Slowly, inexorably, Greek numbers and organization begin to tell. More ships arrive each hour, discharging fresh warriors who can reinforce exhausted comrades. The Trojans, fighting magnificently but outnumbered, begin to give ground grudgingly, contesting every yard of sand with desperate courage. The moment that decides the day comes when Odysseus leads a charge that breaks through the Trojan center, allowing the Greeks to establish a secure perimeter large enough for more substantial landings. Hector, recognizing that the beach can no longer be held, orders a fighting withdrawal to prepared positions inland, saving his army from destruction while yielding the immediate coastline to the enemy. With the beachhead secured, the Greeks face the enormous logistical challenge of establishing a semi-permanent base on hostile territory. This isn't a quick raid that will be over in days or weeks, but a siege that may last months or even years. Everything needed to sustain an army must be either brought from Greece or created on site using materials taken from enemy territory. The camp that takes shape over the following days reveals the organizational sophistication of Bronze Age warfare. Engineers survey the terrain and lay out streets, drainage systems, and defensive perimeters according to principles that won't be seen again until Roman military engineering centuries later. The camp isn't just a collection of tents, but a temporary city designed to house, feed, and protect over 50,000 men for an extended period. Each contingent receives its assigned area based on its size and importance. The Mycenaean section occupies the center, with Agamemnon's headquarters tent serving as both royal residence and command center. The tent itself is a marvel of Bronze Age craftsmanship, made from purple-dyed wool with bronze fittings and ivory decorations that can be assembled and disassembled quickly for military campaigns. Surrounding the royal headquarters, the tents of other major kings create a defensive ring of authority. But this isn't just about protocol, it's practical military planning. If the camp comes under attack, the most experienced commanders will be centrally located where they can coordinate the defense most effectively. The perimeter of the camp receives special attention. Earth embankments topped with wooden palisades create a defensive wall that can withstand both direct assault and siege engines. Gates positioned at strategic points allow controlled movement in and out of the camp, while providing defensive strong points that can be held even if other sections are overrun. But perhaps most impressive is the naval base that extends the camp down to the shoreline. The Greek ships are drawn up on the beach in organized rows, their hulls protected by earthworks, and their crews organized into defensive units that can respond quickly to any Trojan attempt to destroy the fleet. This beach camp will become the Greeks' home for the next decade, the base from which they'll launch raids across the Troad, conduct diplomatic negotiations with potential allies, and wage the siege that will ultimately destroy Troy. But as the Greeks settle into their new quarters and begin planning their campaign, they have no idea that they're embarking on a war that will outlast kings, destroy heroes, and end civilizations. The beachhead is secure, the camp is fortified, and the greatest army in Bronze Age history is ready for war. But Troy's walls rise unbroken on the horizon, and Hector's forces have withdrawn in good order to fight another day. What the Greeks expected to be a quick campaign to recover Helen and punish Paris is about to become something else entirely, a grinding war of attrition that will consume a generation and destroy both civilizations. The siege of Troy is about to begin in earnest, and with it, 9 years of conflict that will transform heroes into legends and kings into corpses. The real war, the war that Homer chose not to sing about, is about to unfold. 3 weeks after establishing their beachhead, the Greeks launched their first major assault against Troy itself, confident that their overwhelming numerical superiority will quickly break the city's defences and end the war before summer turns to autumn. Picture the scene as the largest army ever assembled in the Bronze Age world advances across the Scamander Plain toward the walls that have protected Troy for centuries. The formation is magnificent and terrifying. Over 40,000 warriors advancing in disciplined ranks, their bronze armour glinting in the morning sun like scales on some enormous serpent. At the centre march the heavy infantry, their long spears held at precise angles, their shields overlapping to form an unbroken wall of bronze and leather. The rhythmic tramp of their feet creates a sound like thunder that rolls across the plain, announcing to everyone within miles that the Greeks have come for war. Flanking the main body, cavalry units from Thessaly and other horse-breeding regions scout ahead and protect the flanks from surprise attack. These mounted warriors represent the cutting edge of Bronze Age military technology, men who've spent their lives learning to fight from horseback, wielding spear and sword with deadly effectiveness while controlling their mounts with pressure from knees and weight shifts. Behind the front lines come the specialists who will be crucial if the assault reaches Troy's walls. Engineers drag primitive siege equipment, wield towers that will allow archers to shoot over the city's defences, battering rams reinforced with bronze fittings that can break down gates, and scaling ladders crafted from the finest timber available. These men understand the mathematical principles that govern siege warfare, the angles and forces needed to breach fortifications that have withstood attacks for generations. But perhaps most ominous are the individual heroes who stride ahead of their contingents, seeking personal glory in the coming battle. Achilles runs rather than walks, his divine armour catching the light, his famous spear, the ashwood spear of Peleus that never misses its target, held ready in his right hand. His speed and grace make ordinary warriors look clumsy by comparison, and enemy soldiers who catch sight of him feel their courage wavering despite their numerical disadvantage. Ajax the Greater advances like a walking fortress, his massive figure-8 shield providing protection not just for himself but for the smaller warriors who cluster around him. His presence alone is worth 100 ordinary soldiers, for his reputation has spread across the Bronze Age world as a man who has never been defeated in single combat. Diomedes coordinates the movement with tactical precision that reveals his military genius. Unlike some heroes who fight primarily for personal glory, he understands warfare as a science, using his forces like pieces on a game board to create advantages and exploit enemy weaknesses. His contingent from Argos moves with disciplined coordination that makes them far more effective than their numbers alone would suggest. But as the Greek army approaches Troy's outer defences, they discover that Hector has spent the weeks since the landing preparing surprises that will cost the attackers dearly. The Trojans haven't simply retreated behind their walls to wait for a siege, they've created a defense in depth that will bleed the Greeks white before they ever reach the city proper. The first obstacle is a series of concealed pits dug across the most obvious approach routes to the city. These aren't simple holes in the ground, but sophisticated traps lined with sharpened stakes and covered with branches and soil that make them invisible until someone steps on them. When the Greek advance hits these obstacles, the disciplined formation dissolves into chaos as warriors fall into traps or crowd together trying to avoid them. Trojan archers positioned in carefully prepared positions that give them clear fields of fire while protecting them from return shots, begin sending flights of arrows into the confused Greek ranks. Their composite bows, made from layers of horn, wood and sinew, can drive bronze-tipped arrows through armor at ranges that surprise the Greeks, who have underestimated their enemy's missile capabilities. The real shock comes when Hector leads a cavalry charge from concealed positions among the ridges north of the city. The Prince of Troy has learned from the beachhead battle that Greek infantry, despite their superior numbers, can be disrupted by mobile forces that strike quickly and withdraw before the enemy can respond effectively. Hector himself is magnificent in battle, not just because of his skill with spear and sword, but because of his ability to inspire ordinary soldiers to fight beyond their normal capabilities. When he raises his famous war cry, "For Troy and sacred Ilios," it echoes from the city walls and gives heart to defenders who know they're facing impossible odds. The Trojan cavalry charge hits the Greek left wing just as it's struggling to reorganize after encountering the pit traps. The psychological impact is devastating, horses and riders appearing suddenly from what seemed like empty terrain, bronze spear points glittering as they bear down on infantry formations that haven't had time to set their own spears properly. But the Greeks aren't helpless victims. Achilles responds to the cavalry threat with speed that seems almost supernatural, sprinting across the battlefield to engage Hector in single combat. The duel that follows becomes the stuff of legend, two of the greatest warriors in the world matching skill against skill, divine blessed weapons clashing with sounds like thunder. The combat between Achilles and Hector reveals the difference between their fighting styles and personalities. Achilles fights with the fluid grace of someone who's never known defeat, his every movement economical and precise, his spear work so skilled that it seems to bend the laws of physics. His divine armor, forged by the gods themselves, turns aside Hector's strongest attacks, while his own blows come close to finishing the Trojan prince multiple times. Hector, by contrast, fights with the determination of someone defending everything he holds dear. He may not have Achilles' supernatural gifts, but he has something equally valuable: the knowledge that defeat means not just his own death but the destruction of his city, his family, and his people. This desperate motivation drives him to superhuman efforts, allowing him to match the Greek hero blow for blow despite his theoretical disadvantage. The duel ends not with victory for either hero, but with intervention by the gods themselves. According to various sources, Apollo protects Hector by wrapping him in a cloud of mist, while Athena guides Achilles away from a killing blow that would have ended the war in its first major battle. The two heroes separate, each having gained enormous respect for the other's abilities, both knowing that their next meeting may well be their last. But while the heroes duel, the larger battle has been decided by more practical considerations. The Greeks, despite their numerical superiority, find themselves unable to make meaningful progress against Troy's prepared defences. The combination of terrain obstacles, missile fire, and mobile cavalry creates a tactical situation that neutralizes their advantages while maximizing Trojan strengths. As the sun begins to set, Agamemnon makes the difficult decision to withdraw. The assault has failed, costing hundreds of Greek lives while achieving nothing beyond a clearer understanding of the enemy's capabilities. The army that marched confidently toward Troy in the morning retreats in disorder toward the beach camp, carrying their wounded and learning the bitter lesson that wars aren't won by numbers alone. The failure of the first assault forces both sides to confront an uncomfortable reality. This war will not be decided quickly. Troy's defences are too strong to be taken by storm, while the Greeks' naval superiority prevents any relief from reaching the city by sea. What emerges is a siege in the truest sense, a contest of endurance that will test both sides' ability to maintain their war effort over months and years. For the Greeks, this means transforming their beach camp from a temporary military base into a semi-permanent city capable of supporting a long-term campaign. The organizational challenges are enormous. feeding 40,000 men, maintaining discipline among warriors who came expecting quick glory, and managing the political tensions that inevitably arise when powerful kings are forced to cooperate for extended periods. The camp itself undergoes constant expansion and improvement. What began as simple tents and earthworks evolves into a complex urban environment with specialized districts for different activities. The harbour area becomes a major naval base where ships can be repaired and refitted, with workshops for sailmaking, rope weaving, and the bronze working needed to maintain weapons and armour. The central area around Agamemnon's headquarters develops into an administrative quarter where the complex business of managing the coalition takes place daily. Scribes record the distribution of supplies, track casualties and replacements, and maintain the diplomatic correspondence with kingdoms back in Greece. Maps of the Trojan region, compiled from intelligence gathered by scouting expeditions, cover the walls of planning tents where strategy sessions determine the next phase of operations. But perhaps most important is the development of economic relationships with the surrounding region. The Greeks quickly realized that they cannot survive solely on supplies shipped from homeland. The distances are too great, the risks too high, and the costs too enormous. Instead, they must establish trading relationships with neutral communities in the region, exchanging Greek manufactured goods and captured wealth for the food and raw materials needed to sustain the army. This economic warfare becomes as important as the military campaign. Greek raiding parties systematically attack communities that support Troy, not just to weaken the enemy but to capture the livestock, grain, and other supplies needed to feed their own forces. Coastal towns that refuse to provide supplies find their harbours blockaded by Greek warships, while those that cooperate receive protection and access to Greek trade networks. The psychological challenges of siege warfare prove even more difficult than the logistical ones. Warriors who came to Troy expecting a quick campaign followed by a triumphal return home find themselves settling into a routine that offers little opportunity for the kind of heroic individual combat that Bronze Age culture values most highly. Achilles, in particular, struggles with the transition from active warfare to siege operations. His genius lies in individual combat and the kind of fluid, fast-moving battle where personal skill can determine outcomes. The methodical, grinding nature of siege warfare offers few opportunities for the spectacular victories that would enhance his reputation and satisfy his need for glory. This frustration leads to increasing tensions between Achilles and Agamemnon, the overall commander whose authority depends more on political position than individual prowess. Achilles chafes at taking orders from someone he considers his inferior in combat, while Agamemnon resents the young hero's attitude and the way other warriors look to Achilles for leadership in battle. The conflict becomes more serious when questions arise about the distribution of captured wealth and prisoners. Bronze Age warfare is as much about acquiring treasure and slaves as it is about achieving political objectives, and the allocation of these rewards becomes a constant source of friction among the Greek leadership. As the siege settles into a routine, both sides work to expand their support bases and deny resources to their enemies. The war that began as a confrontation between Troy and the Greek coalition evolves into a regional conflict that draws in communities across Anatolia and the eastern Aegean. For the Greeks, this means systematic campaigns against Troy's allies and trading partners. Under Achilles' leadership, Greek forces launch raids against coastal cities throughout the Troad, capturing wealth that helps fund the war effort while denying Troy access to external support. These expeditions combine military objectives with economic warfare, destroying enemy resources while acquiring the supplies needed to sustain the siege. One of the most successful of these campaigns targets the city of Lyrnessus, ruled by King Minos and allied with Troy through marriage connections and trade agreements. The assault on Lyrnessus demonstrates Greek tactical evolution. Instead of the frontal assaults that failed against Troy itself, they use siegecraft, psychological warfare, and political subversion to achieve victory. The capture of Lyrnessus yields enormous wealth for the Greek war effort, but it also provides prisoners who become sources of intelligence about Trojan plans and capabilities. Among these captives is Briseis, daughter of a local priest, whose beauty makes her a prize coveted by the Greek leadership, and whose eventual assignment to Achilles creates relationships that will have profound consequences for the war's later phases. But the Greeks aren't the only ones playing the alliance game. Priam uses Troy's accumulated wealth and diplomatic connections to bring new allies into the war, creating a coalition that can challenge Greek dominance of the region. From distant Ethiopia comes Memnon with warriors whose exotic weapons and tactics confuse Greek formations accustomed to fighting enemies with familiar equipment and methods. The Amazons, led by their queen Penthesilea, arrive from the shores of the Black Sea with cavalry techniques that rival those of the Thessalians and archery skills that surpass even the Cretans. These warrior women fight with a ferocity that unnerves Greek soldiers raised in cultures where women don't participate in combat, creating psychological advantages that offset their numerical disadvantage. Most significantly, diplomatic pressure from Troy and its allies begins to affect neutral communities throughout the region. Several islands that had been providing supplies to the Greeks switch sides, forcing longer supply lines and more dangerous naval operations. Some Greek allies begin to question whether the war is worth its enormous costs, especially as years pass without decisive results. The most serious threat comes from the possibility of Persian intervention. The great empire to the east has been watching the Greek expedition with interest, and Trojan diplomats work constantly to convince Persian satraps that a Greek victory would threaten Persian interests in Anatolia. If Persia enters the war on Troy's side, the Greeks would face enemies capable of fielding larger armies with superior resources. As the war enters its middle years, both sides settle into patterns of conflict that demonstrate the true nature of Bronze Age siege warfare. This isn't the heroic combat of individual champions that epic poetry celebrates, but the grinding attrition of economic and psychological warfare that determines the fate of civilizations. The Greek strategy evolves into systematic devastation of Troy's support base. Each campaign season brings new raids against allied cities, destruction of agricultural resources, and capture of tribute that would otherwise flow to Troy's treasury. The cumulative effect is to gradually strangle the city economically while building up Greek resources for the final assault. But Troy adapts as well, developing defensive strategies that maximize the advantages of fighting from prepared positions while minimizing exposure to Greek numerical superiority. Hector's tactical innovations include mobile defense tactics that allow small forces to inflict disproportionate casualties on attacking armies, engineering improvements that make the city's walls even more formidable, and intelligence networks that provide advance warning of Greek operations. The human cost of these middle years is enormous for both sides. Casualty lists recorded in various sources include hundreds of named warriors whose deaths removed experienced leaders from both armies. The psychological impact is even greater. As the war drags on, both sides begin to question whether their original objectives justify the enormous sacrifices being demanded. For the Greeks, maintaining coalition unity becomes increasingly difficult as kings return home to deal with problems in their own kingdoms. Some never return, leaving their contingents under the command of subordinates who lack the political authority to make crucial decisions. Others send minimal forces while keeping their best troops at home, effectively reducing their contribution to the common effort. The most serious challenge comes from growing war weariness among ordinary soldiers. Men who enlisted expecting a glorious campaign lasting 1 or 2 seasons find themselves trapped in a conflict that has already consumed years of their lives with no end in sight. Desertion becomes a serious problem, especially among contingents whose home kingdoms are distant and whose kings have little ability to track individual soldiers. By the war's 7th year, both sides are exhausted. Troy's wealth has been largely consumed by the costs of defense and maintaining allies, while the Greek coalition struggles with supply problems, political tensions, and declining morale. The stage is set for the personal conflicts and dramatic events that Homer chose to immortalize in the Iliad, the events of the 10th year that will finally bring this grinding war of attrition to its climactic conclusion. 9 years of war have transformed both armies from the confident forces that first faced each other on the plains of Troy. The Greeks who landed with dreams of quick victory have learned the bitter lessons of siege warfare, while the Trojans who thought their walls made them invincible have seen their empire systematically dismantled by an enemy that refuses to give up. But the real war, the war of heroes and gods that Homer chose to sing about, is about to begin. In the 10th year of the siege, personal conflicts within the Greek leadership will create opportunities that will reshape the entire campaign. The wrath of Achilles, the death of Patroclus, and the final duel between Achilles and Hector will determine not just the fate of Troy, but the destiny of an entire civilization. The stage is set for the events that will make this war immortal in human memory. Picture the Greek camp in the 10th year of the siege, on a morning when the sun rises blood red over the Aegean Sea and the very air seems thick with impending doom. 9 years of war have transformed this temporary military base into a semi-permanent city, but it's a city where death walks among the living and divine anger threatens to destroy everything the Greeks have accomplished. For 9 days, the plague sent by Apollo has ravaged the Greek army with a fury that makes their human enemies seem gentle by comparison. The god's silver bow sends invisible arrows that strike down warriors who have survived years of combat, craftsmen whose skills are irreplaceable, and even the animals that the army depends on for food and transportation. The funeral pyres burn day and night, their smoke rising like a dark column that can be seen from Troy's walls, telling the enemy that the gods themselves have turned against the besiegers. The smell of death permeates everything, not just the sweetly sick odour of decomposing bodies, but the deeper stench of a civilization rotting from within. Soldiers who once kept their bronze armour polished to mirror brightness now let it tarnish because they expect to be dead before the next battle. The disciplined routines of military life have broken down as entire units are decimated by disease, leaving survivors to wonder if they've angered the gods beyond any possibility of forgiveness. In his magnificent tent at the centre of the camp, Agamemnon, king of kings and leader of the expedition, sits on his ivory throne like a man wrestling with forces beyond mortal comprehension. The golden cup in his hands, filled with wine mixed with honey, remains untouched as he stares at maps that now seem meaningless. What good are tactical plans when the gods themselves have declared war on your army? The tent itself reflects both the majesty and the crisis of Greek leadership. Purple tapestries woven with gold thread hang from bronze-fitted posts, while ivory furniture inlaid with precious stones demonstrates the wealth that flows through Mycenaean trade networks. But these symbols of power seem hollow when plague arrows strike down kings as easily as common soldiers. The crisis comes to a head when Calchas, the army's chief prophet, finally reveals the source of Apollo's anger. Standing before the assembled Greek leadership in Agamemnon's tent, the elderly seer's voice shakes not with age but with the terrible knowledge he must impart. His grey beard, stained with the ash of countless sacrifices, frames a face marked by years of reading divine will in the flight of birds and the patterns of sacrificial flames. Great son of Atreus, Calchas begins, using the formal address that acknowledges Agamemnon's royal status while emphasizing the gravity of what he's about to say. The far-shooting god Apollo sends this plague because you have dishonored his priest. Chryses came to ransom his daughter with gifts that would have enriched our treasury, but you sent him away with harsh words and threats. The god demands justice. Return Chryseis to her father without ransom, and sacrifice a hecatomb of bulls to Apollo's honour. The silence that follows is more dangerous than the roar of battle. Agamemnon's face flushes with the anger of a man whose authority has been challenged in front of his subordinates, while his grip on his golden sceptre tightens until his knuckles turn white. For 9 years, he's held this coalition together through the force of his personality and the respect due to his position as the most powerful king in Greece. Now a priest demands that he humble himself before a god and give up a prize that represents his status and his honour. Prophet of evil, Agamemnon replies, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power but also the frustration of a leader facing impossible choices. Never yet have you prophesied good for me. Always you delight in prophecies of doom, and never have you fulfilled a favourable word. Now you would have me return Chryseis, whom I value more than my own wife Clytemnestra, for she surpasses her in form and figure, in mind and accomplishments. But even as he speaks, Agamemnon knows he has no choice. The plague will destroy his army if Apollo's anger continues, and a dead army cannot take Troy or preserve his honour. The King of Kings must bow to divine will, but he will not do so without extracting a price from someone else. Yet I will give her up if that is better, he continues, his voice carrying the cold calculation of a man who has survived Bronze Age politics through careful management of advantage and obligation. I want my people to live, not die, but you must immediately prepare me another prize of honour, lest I alone among the Argives be without a prize, which would not be fitting." This demand reveals the complexity of Bronze Age honour culture. For Agamemnon, giving up Chryseis isn't just about returning a captive, it's about publicly acknowledging defeat and accepting a loss of status that could undermine his authority over the coalition. If he returns his prize without receiving compensation, every king in the army will see it as evidence that his power is waning. But then Achilles speaks, and the entire dynamic of the meeting changes. The young hero rises from his seat with the fluid grace that marks all his movements, his hand resting on the hilt of the silver-studded sword that has never tasted defeat. At 25, he's already acknowledged as the greatest warrior of his generation, and his reputation for directness in speech matches his reputation for deadly skill in battle. "Most glorious son of Atreus, most greedy of all men," Achilles begins, and the formal politeness of the address cannot disguise the contempt in his voice. "How shall the great-hearted Achaeans give you a prize? We know of no great store of wealth lying in common. What we took from captured cities has been distributed, and it would not be fitting for the people to collect it again. Give up the girl to the god now, and we Achaeans will repay you 3 and 4 times over when Zeus grants us to sack the well-walled city of Troy." The response reveals everything about Achilles' character and worldview. Unlike Agamemnon, whose thinking focuses on political relationships and the management of coalitions, Achilles sees the world in terms of individual excellence and divine justice. To him, Agamemnon's concern about losing face is less important than ending the plague and getting back to the business of winning glory through combat. Agamemnon's reply cuts to the heart of the conflict between these two very different types of leader. "Do not thus, good though you are, godlike, Achilles, try to deceive me with your cunning. You will not outwit me or persuade me. Do you want to keep your own prize while I sit here without one? If the great-hearted Achaeans will give me a prize suited to my desires, equal in value to what I lose. But if they will not, then I myself will take a prize, either yours or Ajax's or Odysseus's, and whoever I visit will be angry." This threat transforms a religious crisis into a personal confrontation that will determine the war's outcome. By threatening to take another hero's prize, Agamemnon has moved beyond the question of Apollo's anger to challenge the entire system of honor and reward that holds the Greek coalition together. Achilles' response is immediate and devastating. "Winesack with the face of a dog and the heart of a deer. Never have you dared to arm yourself for battle with your people or go into ambush with the best of the Achaeans. That seems like death to you. Far better it is all through the wide camp of the Achaeans to take away the prizes of anyone who speaks against you. You rule over nobodies, otherwise, son of Atreus, this would be your last outrage." The insult is carefully calculated to destroy Agamemnon's authority. By calling him a coward, Achilles attacks the fundamental basis of leadership in Bronze Age warrior culture. The expectation that kings prove their right to rule through personal prowess in battle. By calling his followers nobodies, he suggests that Agamemnon's power rests on the support of inferior men rather than recognition by true heroes. What happens next reveals the complex relationship between mortal heroes and divine powers in the world of the Iliad. As Achilles' hand moves to his sword hilt and Agamemnon reaches for his own weapon, the confrontation threatens to explode into violence that would destroy the Greek expedition at the moment when unity is most crucial. But then Athena intervenes, visible only to Achilles, her grey eyes flashing with divine intelligence as she grasps the hero's hair from behind to prevent him from drawing his sword. Her appearance is both beautiful and terrible, the goddess of wisdom and warfare combined, representing the divine interest in preventing a disaster that would serve no one's purposes. "I have come from heaven to check your anger," she tells Achilles in words that only he can hear, "if you will obey. Hera sent me, who loves and cares for both of you alike. Come now, cease from strife and do not draw your sword. Instead, revile him with words and tell him how things will be. For I promise you this, and it will surely be accomplished. Hereafter 3 times as many glorious gifts will be given to you because of this outrage. Hold back and obey us." The goddess's intervention reveals the sophisticated theology underlying Homer's narrative. The gods don't simply impose their will on mortals but work through persuasion, offering rewards for cooperation and consequences for defiance. Athena's promise of future compensation shows that divine justice operates on longer timescales than human anger, requiring patience and faith from mortals who serve divine purposes. Achilles accepts the goddess's counsel, but not without making his position clear to everyone present. When the longing for Achilles comes upon the sons of the Achaeans, all of them, and you cannot help them however much you grieve when many fall dying before man-slaying Hector, then you will tear your heart within you in sorrow that you did no honour to the best of the Achaeans. This prophecy will prove devastatingly accurate, but for now it sounds like the empty threat of a young man whose pride has been wounded. The assembled Greek leaders watch as Agamemnon makes his fatal decision, choosing to preserve his immediate authority at the cost of his most valuable military asset. "I will take fair-cheeked Briseis, your prize," Agamemnon declares, speaking directly to Achilles with the cold formality of absolute power, "going myself to your hut, so that you may know well how much mightier I am than you, and so another may shrink from declaring himself equal to me and opposing me to my face." The seizure of Briseis accomplishes exactly what Agamemnon intended. It demonstrates his authority over even the greatest hero, but it also triggers consequences that will prove catastrophic for the Greek cause. For Achilles, losing Briseis isn't just about being deprived of a beautiful captive, it's about being publicly humiliated by a man he considers his inferior in every way that matters. Achilles' response reveals the depth of his character and the sophistication of Homer's psychological insight. "I will not fight for you any more, nor will any of my Myrmidons. You will not see me again in battle until Hector brings the war to our own ships and burns them with fire. Only then, when the need is desperate and you have learned the cost of dishonouring the best of the Achaeans, will I consider taking up my spear again." The withdrawal of Achilles and his Myrmidons removes the Greeks' most effective fighting force at the exact moment when they need it most. But more importantly, it removes the psychological advantage that Achilles' presence gave to Greek morale and the fear it instilled in Trojan hearts. Without their greatest champion, the Greeks must fight knowing that their enemies no longer consider them invincible. With Achilles sulking in his ships and Zeus honouring Thetis' request to grant success to the Trojans until the Greeks honour her son properly, the military situation deteriorates rapidly. Hector, emboldened by divine favour and the absence of his most dangerous opponent, launches aggressive attacks that push the Greeks back toward their own camp for the first time in 9 years. The psychological impact on both armies is immediate and profound. Trojan soldiers who have spent years fighting defensively suddenly discover that they can take the offensive, driving their enemies back across terrain that has been contested for nearly a decade. Greek warriors who have grown accustomed to tactical superiority find themselves outfought by enemies who now have both divine favour and renewed confidence. Hector's leadership during this phase reveals why he's considered Troy's greatest asset after the city's walls themselves. Unlike Achilles, whose genius lies in individual combat, Hector excels at inspiring ordinary soldiers to fight beyond their normal capabilities. His presence on the battlefield transforms Trojan farmers and craftsmen into warriors who can match the professional soldiers of the Greek coalition. The Prince of Troy understands that this opportunity may not come again. With Achilles withdrawn and Zeus supporting the Trojan cause, he has a chance to end the war through military victory rather than simply outlasting the siege. His strategy becomes increasingly aggressive, aiming not just to drive the Greeks back, but to destroy their army entirely and burn their ships. The Greek response reveals the coalition's underlying weaknesses. Without Achilles to provide both military leadership and symbolic inspiration, the various contingents begin fighting more as separate armies than as a unified force. Kings who have spent years subordinating their egos to the common cause now compete for glory and recognition, undermining the tactical coordination that has been their main advantage over Trojan forces. Agamemnon himself proves inadequate to the crisis, lacking both the military skills and the moral authority needed to rally his forces. His decision to dishonour Achilles has cost him the respect of the other heroes, who now question his judgment and his fitness for supreme command. The coalition that seemed invincible 9 years ago begins to fracture under the pressure of Trojan success and internal recrimination. The crisis deepens when an embassy is sent to Achilles begging him to return to battle. Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix, representing the three types of appeal that might persuade the hero, approach him with an offer that includes magnificent gifts, the return of Briseis, and a formal apology from Agamemnon. But Achilles' refusal reveals how deeply the insult has wounded not just his pride but his understanding of what makes life worth living. In his response to the embassy, he questions the very foundations of heroic culture. The same honor waits for the coward and the brave. They both go down to death, the fighter who shirks, the one who works to exhaustion. This speech represents one of literature's first great meditations on the meaning of existence and the value of heroic action. Achilles has reached a crisis point where the traditional rewards of Bronze Age warrior culture, honor, glory, and material wealth, no longer seem worth the risks they require. His withdrawal isn't just tactical but existential, reflecting a fundamental questioning of the values that drive both the war and the society that wages it. The event that finally draws Achilles back into the war is the death of Patroclus, his beloved companion and closest friend. When the Trojans push their attack all the way to the Greek ships and begin threatening the naval base that represents the expedition's only escape route, Patroclus begs Achilles for permission to enter the battle wearing his friend's armor. The relationship between Achilles and Patroclus represents one of the deepest friendships in all literature, a bond that transcends simple military alliance to approach the sacred relationships that Bronze Age culture considered more important than marriage or family. When Patroclus speaks, he does so with the authority of someone who knows Achilles better than anyone else alive. "My dear friend," Patroclus pleads, his voice carrying the weight of years of shared experiences and mutual dependence, "if you will not fight yourself, at least let me wear your armor and lead the Myrmidons into battle. The sight of your arms may frighten the Trojans enough to give our people breathing space." Achilles agrees, but his instructions to Patroclus reveal his understanding that this compromise contains the seeds of tragedy. "Drive the Trojans from our ships, but do not pursue them toward the city. Content yourself with saving the fleet and return immediately when that's accomplished." But Patroclus, once engaged in battle, discovers the intoxication of combat success that has driven heroes throughout the ages. Wearing Achilles' divine armor and fighting with skills honed through years of training with the greatest warrior alive, he becomes unstoppable on the battlefield. Trojan forces that have been winning steadily for weeks suddenly find themselves facing what appears to be Achilles himself returned to battle. The psychological impact is devastating for Trojan morale. Soldiers who had been advancing confidently toward final victory suddenly see their greatest enemy bearing down on them with divine weapons flashing. The retreat that follows threatens to become a rout that could end the war with complete Trojan defeat, but Patroclus, drunk on success and glory, ignores Achilles' instructions and pursues the fleeing Trojans toward the city walls. There, far from the ships he was supposed to protect, he encounters Hector in single combat and meets his death at the hands of Troy's greatest champion. The moment of Patroclus' death changes everything. Hector strips Achilles' armor from the corpse, claiming it as his rightful prize, while the battle for Patroclus' body becomes one of the war's most savage engagements. When news of his friend's death reaches Achilles, the hero's grief transforms into rage that will reshape the entire conflict. The death of Patroclus accomplishes what 9 years of war and diplomatic pressure could not. It brings Achilles back into the conflict with a fury that will eclipse everything that came before. But the hero who returns to battle is not the same man who withdrew in anger over a slight to his honor. This Achilles is driven by grief and rage that make him more dangerous than any warrior in the Bronze Age world, but also more tragic. The final phase of the Iliad, the return of Achilles, his duel with Hector, and the ransoming of Hector's body by Priam, will explore themes of mortality, revenge, and forgiveness that make Homer's epic immortal. But it will also set up the events that Homer chose not to sing about: the death of Achilles himself, the fall of Troy, and the bitter homecomings that await the Greek heroes. The war is entering its final phase, and the greatest hero of the age is about to learn that victory always comes at a price. To understand the complete story of the Trojan War, we must venture beyond Homer's masterpieces into the shadowy realm of lost literature. The epic cycle, a collection of poems that once told the entire story from Helen's abduction to the final returns of the Greek heroes. These epics, now surviving only in fragments and later summaries, filled the gaps that Homer deliberately left open, providing the ancient world with a complete narrative that spanned decades and involved gods and mortals in a cosmic drama. Picture the great library of Alexandria in its prime, around 200 BCE, where scholars worked to preserve and catalogue the literary heritage of the ancient world. Among the papyrus scrolls that lined the walls were complete copies of epics whose names we know, but whose words are largely lost. The Cypria, which told of the war's origins and the first 9 years. The Ethiopis, which continued from Homer's Iliad to narrate the deaths of Achilles and other heroes. The Little Iliad and the Sack of Ilion, which described Troy's final destruction. And the Returns, which followed the Greek heroes' troubled journeys home. These poems were attributed to various legendary figures, Stasinus of Cyprus for the Cypria, Arctinus of Miletus for the Ethiopis and Sack of Ilion, Lesches of Mytilene for the Little Iliad. Whether these were historical individuals or traditional names attached to anonymous works, we cannot know. What's certain is that these epics represented centuries of oral tradition crystallized into written form, preserving versions of the Troy story that were sometimes very different from Homer's vision. The differences reveal how the story evolved and adapted to different audiences and purposes. Where Homer focused on psychological realism and the tragic consequences of human choices, the cyclic epics were more interested in supernatural events, exotic adventures, and the kind of fantastic episodes that oral tradition loves to elaborate. They included shape-changing gods, magical weapons, prophetic dreams, and the sort of divine interventions that Homer used sparingly, but which audiences clearly enjoyed. More importantly for our investigation, these lost epics sometimes preserved historical details that Homer chose to omit or downplay. The Cypria's detailed account of the war's origins included specific genealogies, geographical information, and political relationships that suggest access to genuine Bronze Age traditions. Its description of the coalition's assembly and the diplomatic negotiations that preceded the war may preserve memories of actual late Bronze Age international relations. The fragments we possess come to us through various channels, each presenting its own challenges for interpretation. Some survive as direct quotations in later authors who were arguing about literary technique or mythological details. Others exist only in plot summaries compiled by Byzantine scholars who had access to complete texts that have since vanished. Still others can be reconstructed from art objects, vase paintings, sculpture, metalwork, that illustrate scenes from episodes that must have been well known to ancient audiences. The most valuable source for the epic cycle's content is a summary compiled by a scholar known as Proclus, probably in the 5th century CE. His plot outlines preserve the basic narrative structure of each epic, allowing us to understand how the complete story was organized and how it differed from Homer's selective treatment. According to Proclus, the Cypria began with Zeus's decision to reduce human population through war, moved through the judgment of Paris and Helen's abduction, described the gathering of the Greek fleet and the sacrifice at Aulis, narrated the landing at Troy and the first 9 years of war, and concluded with the events that immediately preceded the opening of Homer's Iliad. The Ethiopis picked up where the Iliad ended, continuing with Achilles' victories over the Amazon queen Penthesilea and the Ethiopian prince Memnon, his own death at the hands of Paris and Apollo, the contest for his armor between Ajax and Odysseus, and Ajax's subsequent suicide. The Little Iliad described the arrival of Philoctetes with Heracles' bow, the death of Paris, and the construction of the wooden horse. The Sack of Ilion provided a detailed account of Troy's final night, while the Returns followed the various Greek heroes on their journeys home. Together, these epics created a narrative scope that dwarfed even Homer's mighty poems. They transformed the Trojan War from a conflict between human armies into a cosmic drama where gods and mortals collaborated and competed across generations, where individual choices had consequences that rippled through time, and where the fate of entire civilizations hung on moments of courage, betrayal, love, and honor. One of the most important episodes missing from Homer's account is the death of Achilles himself, an event so central to the war's mythology that it's surprising the Iliad doesn't include it. But Homer's decision to end with Hector's funeral was deliberate. He wanted to focus on the tragedy of choice and consequence rather than simply providing a complete narrative. The death of Achilles was left for other poets to explore, and their versions reveal fascinating insights about how the story evolved and what it meant to different audiences. The Aethiopis, according to Proclus's summary, described Achilles' death as the climax of his greatest victories. After killing Hector, the hero goes on to defeat two more formidable opponents, Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, and Memnon, prince of Ethiopia and son of the dawn goddess Eos. These victories establish Achilles as the supreme warrior of his age, a hero whose prowess surpasses not just mortal enemies but champions with divine ancestry. The episode with Penthesilea, in particular, reveals the complexity of ancient attitudes toward both warfare and gender. The Amazon queen arrives at Troy with a force of warrior women whose fighting style and equipment differ dramatically from anything the Greeks have encountered. These aren't the conventional heavy infantry that dominate most Bronze Age battlefields, but mobile cavalry archers who strike quickly and withdraw before enemies can respond. Penthesilea herself is described as beautiful, brave, and skilled enough to pose a genuine threat to Greek victory. Her duel with Achilles becomes not just a military engagement, but a tragic encounter between two champions who might, in different circumstances, have been allies or even lovers. According to some later sources, Achilles falls in love with Penthesilea at the moment he kills her, adding psychological complexity to what could have been a simple combat episode. The fight with Memnon presents different challenges and different insights into Bronze Age cultural values. Memnon arrives at Troy leading Ethiopian forces equipped with exotic weapons and fighting techniques that reflect trade connections between the Bronze Age Mediterranean and the kingdoms of Africa. His divine ancestry, he's the son of Eos, goddess of the dawn, makes him a worthy opponent for Achilles, whose own mother is the sea goddess Thetis. But more importantly, Memnon's presence at Troy reflects the international scope of the Bronze Age world. Ancient sources consistently portray the Trojan War as a conflict that drew participants from across the known world, creating alliances and enmities that stretched from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Ethiopian involvement in a war in northwestern Anatolia might seem improbable to modern audiences, but Bronze Age trade networks and diplomatic relationships made such connections routine. Achilles' actual death, according to most sources, comes not from superior human enemies but from divine intervention. Paris, guided by Apollo, shoots an arrow that strikes Achilles in his only vulnerable spot, the heel where his mother held him when she dipped him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable. This version of the death scene reflects sophisticated theological thinking about the relationship between human excellence and divine will. Achilles represents the pinnacle of mortal achievement, courage, skill, beauty, and strength raised to their highest possible expression, but precisely because he approaches divine levels of excellence, he becomes a threat to the cosmic order that requires separation between mortal and immortal realms. Apollo's role as the agent of Achilles' death makes perfect theological sense. As the god of archery, music, prophecy, and boundaries, Apollo represents the divine principles that Achilles' superhuman capabilities threaten to violate. The arrow that kills the hero doesn't just end his life but restores proper cosmic balance by eliminating a mortal who had begun to rival the gods themselves. The aftermath of Achilles' death, described in various sources, reveals how deeply his loss affects both armies. The Greeks, deprived of their greatest champion and psychological anchor, face the possibility of complete military collapse. The Trojans, despite their enemy's weakness, recognize that killing Achilles has cost them their best hope for a negotiated settlement. With the hero dead, the war must now continue until one side or the other is completely destroyed. No element of the Troy story is more famous than the wooden horse, yet it's also one of the most historically problematic aspects of the entire narrative. The story doesn't appear in Homer's Iliad at all. It's only briefly mentioned in the Odyssey when Odysseus reminisces about the stratagem that finally brought victory. The full account comes from the Little Iliad and later sources, which describe an elaborate deception that allowed the Greeks to infiltrate Troy's seemingly impregnable defences. According to these sources, the wooden horse was conceived by Odysseus as the solution to a tactical problem that had defied resolution for 10 years. Troy's walls were too strong to be breached by conventional siege methods. The city's supplies were adequate for a prolonged defense, and the Trojan army remained capable of effective resistance despite years of attrition. A direct assault would cost more Greek lives than the expedition could afford, while continuing the siege indefinitely risked the complete collapse of the coalition. The horse itself, as described in ancient sources, was a masterpiece of Bronze Age engineering and craftsmanship. Built by Appius, the expedition's master carpenter, it stood 30 feet high and was large enough to conceal a force of elite warriors in its hollow interior. The exterior was carved and painted to resemble a magnificent offering to Athena, goddess of both warfare and craftsmanship, making it plausible that the Greeks would leave such a treasure as a votive offering when they departed. But the horse was more than just a hiding place. It was the centerpiece of an elaborate psychological operation designed to exploit Trojan religious beliefs and political divisions. The Greeks didn't simply build the horse and sail away. They created an entire fictional narrative about why they were abandoning the siege and what the horse represented. According to the plan, the Greeks would burn their camp and sail their fleet beyond the horizon, leaving behind only the horse and a single survivor, Sinon, a volunteer who would allow himself to be captured and tell a carefully prepared story. Sinon would claim that the Greeks had given up the siege because unfavorable omens indicated divine displeasure with their cause. The horse, he would explain, was an offering to Athena designed to ensure safe passage home, built deliberately too large to fit through Troy's gates so the Trojans couldn't steal it and gain the goddess's favor for themselves. The psychological sophistication of this deception reveals deep understanding of human nature and religious thinking. Rather than simply trying to trick the Trojans into bringing the horse inside their walls, the Greeks created a scenario where the Trojans would want to do so despite warnings and suspicions. By making the horse too large for the gates, they ensured that bringing it inside would require deliberate effort, tearing down part of the wall or dismantling the gates themselves, making the Trojans feel that they were actively choosing to claim this prize rather than simply falling for a trick. The Trojan response, as described in various sources, reveals the political tensions that 10 years of siege had created within the city. King Priam and many of the older leaders are suspicious of the gift and want to destroy it or leave it outside the walls. But younger Trojans, led by Priam's sons other than Hector, who died in the previous year, argue for bringing the horse inside as both a religious offering and a trophy of victory. The debate that follows touches on fundamental questions about divine will, military judgment, and political authority that resonate throughout ancient literature. Cassandra, the prophet princess cursed to speak truth but never be believed, warns that the horse will bring destruction. Laocoon, priest of Apollo, argues for extreme caution and famously throws a spear at the horse's side, causing it to ring hollow and nearly exposing the deception. But then, divine intervention tips the balance in favor of those who want to accept the gift. According to most sources, 2 enormous serpents emerge from the sea and kill Laocoon and his sons, an event that the Trojans interpret as divine punishment for threatening Athena's offering. This supernatural confirmation of Sinon's story overcomes the remaining resistance to bringing the horse inside. From an archaeological perspective, the wooden horse presents obvious problems. Wood doesn't survive 3,000 years, and the story has clear mythological elements that make literal interpretation difficult, but some scholars argue that the horse tradition might preserve memories of actual siege tactics used in Bronze Age warfare. Assyrian reliefs from the 9th and 8th centuries BCE show elaborate wooden siege engines, wheeled towers, battering rams, and mobile platforms used for attacking fortified cities. These machines were often decorated with animal motifs and could indeed conceal soldiers inside protective wooden shells. If Troy fell to some kind of siege engine rather than through divine intervention or clever stratagem, later oral tradition might have transformed a practical military device into the legendary wooden horse. More intriguingly, earthquake damage at archaeological Troy might explain how the horse tradition developed. Troy 6 was destroyed by an earthquake around 1300 BCE, and Troy 7 shows signs of hasty reconstruction. In Bronze Age religious thinking, earthquakes were caused by Poseidon, the earth shaker, whose sacred animal was the horse. If historical Troy fell during an earthquake that breached its walls, later tradition might have preserved this divine intervention as a wooden horse sent by the gods. The sack of Ilion, one of the lost epics of the cycle, provided ancient audiences with a detailed account of Troy's final night, a narrative so brutal and devastating that later authors often struggled to describe it adequately. Unlike Homer's Iliad, which focuses on individual psychology and moral choices, the sack dealt with mass violence, systematic destruction, and the complete breakdown of civilized behavior that occurs when cities fall to assault. According to the fragments and summaries that survive, the night began with the Greek warriors emerging from the horse and opening Troy's gates for their comrades, who had returned under cover of darkness. But what followed wasn't simply military occupation. It was the deliberate obliteration of a civilization that had resisted conquest for 10 years. The archaeological evidence from Troy 7a supports this literary picture of sudden, violent destruction. The excavation levels corresponding to around 1180 BCE show clear signs of massive fire, with evidence of burning throughout the city. Human skeletal remains found in the destruction layers show signs of violent death, crushed skulls, embedded arrowheads, and the kind of trauma patterns associated with urban warfare. But perhaps most tellingly, the destruction layer contains evidence of hasty abandonment. Valuable objects, bronze weapons, gold jewelry, silver vessels, were left behind by people who clearly had no time to gather their possessions before fleeing or dying. This isn't the pattern of gradual decline or negotiated surrender, but of catastrophic defeat that gave the inhabitants no opportunity to save either their lives or their wealth. The literary sources describe systematic atrocities that reveal the dark side of Bronze Age warfare. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, kills King Priam at the altar of Zeus, where the old king has sought sanctuary, a violation of religious law that horrifies even other Greeks. Ajax the Lesser rapes Cassandra in Athena's temple, another act of sacrilege that will bring divine punishment on the entire Greek fleet. But the sack of Ilion wasn't interested only in catalogue atrocities, it also explored the psychological and moral consequences of total victory. Greek heroes who had fought honourably for 10 years found themselves making choices that violated their deepest beliefs about justice, honour, and proper conduct. The city that had resisted them so long became the object of revenge that went far beyond military necessity. The treatment of Troy's royal family illustrates the complete breakdown of Bronze Age conventions about the treatment of prisoners. Hector's infant son Astyanax is thrown from the city walls to prevent him from growing up to avenge his father, a decision that violates every principle about the protection of children and non-combatants. Hector's wife Andromache is enslaved to Neoptolemus, while Hecuba, Priam's queen, is given to Odysseus as part of his share of the spoils. These episodes reveal how warfare could transform civilized men into something approaching monsters. The heroes who emerge from Troy's destruction are very different from the idealistic warriors who landed on the Trojan shore 10 years earlier. They've learned that victory can be more costly than defeat, that achieving your goals doesn't necessarily justify the methods required to achieve them. The burning of Troy itself becomes a symbol of civilization's fragility. The city that had stood for centuries, that had survived earthquakes and invasions and political upheavals, disappears in a single night of fire and violence. The archaeological evidence suggests that Troy 7a was never rebuilt on the same scale. The destruction was so complete that the site remained largely abandoned for generations. But the sack of Ilion also included episodes that pointed toward hope and renewal. Aeneas, son of Aphrodite and prince of the Dardanians, escapes the burning city carrying his aged father Anchises and leading his young son Ascanius, an image that later Roman poets would use to symbolize the continuity of civilization despite temporary defeats. According to various traditions, Aeneas and his followers eventually reach Italy, where they become ancestors of the Roman people. This tradition, whether historically accurate or not, reveals how ancient audiences understood the meaning of Troy's fall. It wasn't simply the end of one city, but a transformation that would reshape the entire Mediterranean world. The heroes and refugees who survived Troy's destruction would carry its legacy to new homes, creating fresh civilizations that would incorporate both Greek and Trojan elements. The complete story preserved in the epic cycle reveals the Trojan War as something far more complex and devastating than Homer's focused narrative suggests. This wasn't just a conflict between two armies, but a civilizational catastrophe that destroyed the Bronze Age world and cleared the way for new forms of human organization. But the end of Troy wasn't the end of the story. The Greek heroes who survived the war still faced the challenge of returning home to kingdoms that had changed during their long absence. The homecoming journeys, some successful, others tragic, would test whether the skills that served them well in war could help them rebuild the peaceful world they had left behind. The Returns, the final epic of the cycle, would explore these themes of transition and adaptation, showing how victory in war doesn't guarantee happiness in peace, and how the trauma of prolonged conflict follows warriors long after the fighting ends. The Greek fleet that departs from the smoking ruins of Troy bears little resemblance to the proud armada that had crossed the Aegean 10 years earlier. Where once there were over 1,000 black ships carrying the flower of Bronze Age Greek civilization, now fewer than half that number remain, their hulls scarred by battle, their crews consisting largely of war-weary veterans who have forgotten what peace feels like. But the physical damage to the fleet is nothing compared to the spiritual corruption that has infected the expedition during its final triumph. The atrocities committed during Troy's sack have violated so many sacred laws that the gods themselves have turned against the victors. What should have been a joyous homecoming becomes instead a journey through divine punishment that will scatter the Greek heroes across the known world and destroy many of them entirely. The catalyst for divine anger is Ajax the Lesser's rape of Cassandra in Athena's temple, a crime so serious that it pollutes not just the individual perpetrator but his entire community. When the other Greek leaders fail to punish Ajax adequately, they become complicit in his sacrilege, earning divine wrath that will follow them across the seas. Athena herself, who had been the Greeks' patron throughout the war, petitions Zeus for permission to punish the expedition. Her request reveals the complex theology underlying ancient Greek thinking about justice and collective responsibility. Individual crimes can contaminate entire communities, requiring purification or punishment that extends far beyond the original perpetrator. Father Zeus, the goddess argues before the divine assembly, see how these mortals have repaid my favor. I gave them victory over Troy, guided their weapons in battle, and protected their ships from enemy fire. But they allowed my temple to be defiled and my priestess to be violated. If such crimes go unpunished, mortals will cease to honor the gods and the cosmic order itself will collapse. Zeus's response sets in motion the chain of disasters that will mark the Greek homecoming. Daughter, your anger is justified. Let the Greeks learn that victory without honor is worthless, and that the gods' favor must be earned through proper conduct, not simply claimed through success. The divine punishment begins almost immediately after the fleet departs Troy. As the ships sail southwest across the Aegean, supernatural storms arise that scatter the expedition across hundreds of miles of hostile water. These aren't natural weather patterns, but divine interventions that deliberately separate the Greek contingents from each other, leaving individual commanders to face their fates alone. The storm that destroys Ajax the Lesser is particularly dramatic, revealing the personal attention that divine justice pays to individual cases. Poseidon himself splits the rock where Ajax takes refuge, sending the rapist to the bottom of the sea while sparing his innocent crew members. This selective divine intervention demonstrates that the gods distinguish between levels of guilt, punishing leaders while showing mercy to followers who had no choice in their commanders' decisions. But the other Greek leaders face more complex punishments that reflect the subtlety of divine justice. Rather than simply destroying them outright, the gods create scenarios where the hero's own character flaws lead to their downfall. Victory in war hasn't made them better people. In many cases, it's revealed their worst qualities and amplified their existing weaknesses. Of all the Greek leaders, Agamemnon's homecoming is the most tragic because it reveals how completely the war has poisoned relationships that should have provided refuge and renewal. The King of Kings returns to Mycenae expecting to resume his role as husband and father, only to discover that his wife Clytemnestra has spent the war years planning his destruction. The roots of this domestic tragedy lie in the sacrifice of Iphigenia at Aulis 10 years earlier. Clytemnestra has never forgiven her husband for choosing military success over their daughter's life, and the years of war have given her time to plan revenge that matches the calculated brutality of her husband's original crime. Picture Mycenae on the day of Agamemnon's return as seen from the great palace that crowns the citadel. The massive cyclopean walls that once represented security and power now seem like prison walls that will trap their returning king. In the royal quarters, Clytemnestra makes final preparations for a banquet that will become a bloodbath, her movements calm and deliberate as someone who has spent years perfecting every detail of her plan. She's not acting alone. Her lover Aegisthus, Agamemnon's cousin and rival for the throne, provides both emotional support and practical assistance. But this isn't simply adultery motivated by loneliness or political ambition. Clytemnestra's relationship with Aegisthus represents a complete rejection of the marriage system that allowed Agamemnon to sacrifice their daughter for military advantage. The homecoming itself unfolds with the formal ceremony appropriate for a victorious king's return. Agamemnon's ships are sighted from the palace walls, signal fires spread the news across the Argive plain, and crowds gather to welcome home the man who led the greatest military expedition in their history. The king himself disembarks wearing the spoils of victory, golden armor, purple robes, and other treasures that demonstrate his success at Troy. But Clytemnestra's welcome reveals the psychological sophistication of her revenge plan. Rather than confronting her husband immediately, she greets him with apparent joy and honor, spreading purple tapestries for him to walk on as he approaches the palace. This gesture seems like appropriate recognition of his achievement, but it's actually a trap that exploits Agamemnon's pride and his ignorance of proper religious protocol. Walking on purple textiles was considered a divine prerogative in Bronze Age culture, an act of hubris that invited divine punishment. By encouraging her husband to commit this sacrilege, Clytemnestra ensures that his death will seem like divine justice rather than personal revenge. The gods themselves will appear to sanction what she's about to do. Agamemnon's death takes place during the welcome feast, in a scene that combines intimate domestic setting with calculated violence. As the king relaxes in his own great hall, surrounded by family and friends, Clytemnestra and Aegisthus strike with weapons concealed beneath ceremonial robes. The symbolism is deliberate. Agamemnon dies not in battle against foreign enemies, but in his own home, killed by the people who should have loved him most. The aftermath of the murder reveals how completely the war has destroyed traditional Bronze Age social structures. Clytemnestra and Aegisthus seize control of Mycenae, ruling jointly while eliminating potential rivals to their authority. But their victory is temporary. Agamemnon's son Orestes, protected by loyal followers, escapes to plan his own revenge, ensuring that the cycle of violence will continue into the next generation. While Agamemnon meets his doom in Mycenae, his brother Menelaus faces a very different kind of punishment that tests his character in ways that pure suffering could not. Instead of dying quickly or suffering obvious divine retribution, Menelaus is condemned to 8 years of wandering across the Mediterranean, unable to reach home despite numerous attempts. This extended journey, described in various sources including Homer's Odyssey, becomes a test of the marriage that started the entire war. Menelaus and Helen, reunited after 10 years of separation and conflict, must rediscover whether their relationship can survive the trauma both have experienced. The war was fought ostensibly to recover Helen and restore their marriage, but victory has left both spouses profoundly changed. Helen herself remains one of the most psychologically complex characters in all ancient literature. The woman who returns with Menelaus is not the young bride who was abducted from Sparta, but a mature person who has experienced the extremes of both love and hatred, who has seen an entire civilization destroyed because of her beauty, and who must somehow find a way to live with the consequences of choices made in passion. Different sources present different versions of Helen's psychological state during the wanderings. In some, she's genuinely repentant about the suffering her actions caused, working actively to rebuild her marriage and restore her reputation. In others, she remains defiant about her choices, arguing that the gods forced her actions and that mortals shouldn't be held responsible for divine manipulation. The geographical scope of their wanderings reflects the international connections of the Bronze Age world. Menelaus and Helen visit Egypt, Libya, Cyprus, and numerous other locations around the eastern Mediterranean, encountering civilizations that have heard about the Trojan War and formed their own opinions about its participants. In Egypt, according to Herodotus's version, they discover that Egyptian priests have preserved the real Helen throughout the war, claiming that only a phantom image went to Troy while the actual woman waited in safety in the Nile Delta. This alternative version of events forces both Menelaus and Helen to confront questions about identity, reality, and the nature of the conflict that consumed 10 years of their lives. The Egyptian episode reveals ancient Greek fascination with questions that modern audiences would recognize as philosophical problems about appearance and reality. If the war was fought over a phantom, what does that say about the value of heroic action? If the real Helen never left Sparta, what do Menelaus's sufferings mean? These questions don't have simple answers, and the ancient sources deliberately leave them unresolved. Eventually, Menelaus and Helen do reach home, but their return to Sparta represents not a restoration of the pre-war status quo, but the creation of something entirely new. The marriage they rebuild is based on shared experience of trauma rather than youthful passion, and the kingdom they rule has been changed by a decade of absence and the broader collapse of Bronze Age civilization. Of all the Greek heroes, Odysseus faces the longest and most varied punishment for his role in Troy's destruction. His 10-year journey home to Ithaca, immortalized in Homer's Odyssey, becomes not just a physical adventure, but a spiritual odyssey that tests every aspect of his character and forces him to confront the psychological cost of his wartime actions. Odysseus's particular punishment fits his particular crimes. As the architect of Troy's destruction through the wooden horse stratagem, he bears special responsibility for the atrocities that followed the city's fall. His intelligence and strategic thinking, which made him invaluable during the war, now become sources of additional suffering as he must outwit supernatural enemies who challenge him on his own terms. The monsters and divine opponents that Odysseus encounters during his wanderings aren't random obstacles but carefully designed tests that reveal different aspects of his personality. The Cyclops Polyphemus challenges his cleverness but also his tendency toward hubris and self-aggrandizement. The Sirens test his intellectual curiosity against the need for self-preservation. Circe forces him to choose between comfortable stagnation and difficult progress toward his ultimate goal. But perhaps the most significant challenge comes from his own crew, whose gradual loss throughout the journey reflects the impossibility of returning unchanged from such a traumatic experience. The men who sailed from Troy with Odysseus represent his connections to the world of war and conquest. Their deaths symbolize his necessary abandonment of the warrior identity that served him during the conflict, but which has no place in the peaceful world he's trying to reach. When Odysseus finally reaches Ithaca, he discovers that homecoming is not a destination but a process. His palace has been overrun by suitors who assume he's dead and compete for his wife Penelope's hand. His son Telemachus has grown up without a father and must learn to recognize and trust the stranger who claims to be his parent. Even his wife Penelope tests him carefully before accepting that the scarred, aged wanderer is really the husband who left for Troy 20 years earlier. The slaughter of the suitors that concludes the Odyssey represents Odysseus's final transformation from wandering hero to restored king. But this violence is very different from the warfare at Troy. It's precise, calculated, and aimed at restoring proper order rather than simply achieving victory. The man who destroys the suitors is recognizably the same person who conceived the wooden horse, but he's also someone who has learned the difference between necessary violence and gratuitous destruction. The returns of the Greek heroes reveal that victory in war doesn't guarantee success in peace, and that the skills needed for conquest are often useless for reconstruction. The Bronze Age world that emerges from the Trojan War is very different from the one that entered it, smaller, poorer, and more violent, but also perhaps wiser about the true costs of heroic ambition. But the story of Troy's impact on human civilization doesn't end with the heroes' homecomings. The memory of the war, preserved in oral tradition and eventually written literature, would influence how later civilizations understood warfare, heroism, and the relationship between individual choice and historical consequence. The final question remains: what really happened at Troy? Behind the myths and legends, the divine interventions and supernatural episodes, can we discover historical events that might explain how this story captured human imagination so completely? To answer that question, we need to examine the archaeological evidence one more time and consider what modern science can tell us about the reality behind the legend. To understand what really happened at Troy, we must begin with the man who first tried to prove that Homer's epic was based on historical fact. Heinrich Schliemann's excavations at Hisarlik in the 1870s didn't just uncover ancient ruins, they revolutionized how we think about the relationship between literature and archaeology, between myth and history. Picture Schliemann on that first morning in 1870, standing on the unremarkable hill called Hisarlik with Homer's Iliad in one hand and a survey map in the other. The local farmers who watched him begin his excavations couldn't have imagined that this German businessman was about to change archaeology forever. His approach was revolutionary for its time. Instead of simply collecting beautiful objects for museums, he was testing a historical hypothesis using the material remains of the past. Schliemann's methods were crude by modern standards. He essentially dug a massive trench through the center of the mound, destroying much valuable evidence in his haste to reach what he believed was Homer's Troy. But his discoveries were electrifying. Layer after layer of ancient cities emerged from the earth, each with its own pottery styles, architectural techniques, and cultural artifacts that told the story of human occupation spanning thousands of years. The most spectacular discovery came in 1873, when Schliemann's workers uncovered what he immediately dubbed Priam's treasure, a cache of gold and silver objects that seemed to confirm Homer's descriptions of Troy's wealth. Golden diadems, silver cups, bronze weapons, and jewelry crafted with techniques that demonstrated sophisticated metallurgical knowledge. The treasure was everything that Homer's poetry suggested about Bronze Age royal wealth, but Schliemann made a crucial error that wouldn't be corrected for decades. He identified this treasure with Troy too, a city that archaeological dating later revealed was destroyed around 2500 BCE, more than 1,000 years before the traditional date of the Trojan War. The Priam's treasure that so perfectly matched Homer's descriptions actually belonged to a Bronze Age civilization that flourished long before Greeks and Trojans ever existed. This mistake reveals both the promise and the peril of using literature to guide archaeological investigation. Schliemann's faith in Homer led him to the right place and motivated him to dig with unprecedented systematic thoroughness. But his desire to confirm the epic's historical accuracy also led him to misinterpret his discoveries, seeing confirmations of the Iliad where a more objective analysis might have reached different conclusions. Later archaeologists, working with more sophisticated techniques and less emotional investment in proving Homer right, gradually corrected Schliemann's dating errors and identified the layers that actually corresponded to the late Bronze Age period when the Trojan War supposedly occurred. Troy 6 and Troy 7a, dating to roughly 1700 to 1180 BCE, emerged as the candidates for Homer's city. These discoveries revealed a complex picture that both supported and challenged the literary tradition. There really was a great city at the location where ancient sources placed Troy, and this city really was destroyed by fire around the time when the war supposedly occurred. But the archaeological city was much smaller than Homer's descriptions suggested, and the evidence for a great siege was ambiguous at best. Modern archaeological work at Troy, conducted by teams from the University of Cincinnati and the University of Tübingen, has revealed details about late Bronze Age life at the site that would amaze both Schliemann and Homer. Using techniques like ground-penetrating radar, chemical analysis of soil samples, and computer modeling of ancient architecture, today's archaeologists can reconstruct the daily life of Troy's inhabitants with remarkable precision. Troy 6, the city that flourished from about 1700 to 1300 BCE, was indeed impressive by Bronze Age standards. Massive walls built of carefully fitted limestone blocks rose over 30 feet above the surrounding plain, with towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire for defenders. The engineering sophistication of these fortifications rivals anything built in the ancient world. The sloping walls were designed to deflect siege weapons, while the height and thickness made scaling or breaching extremely difficult. Inside the walls, Troy 6 reveals a well-planned urban environment that speaks of wealth, sophistication, and international connections. Houses built in the Anatolian style, multi-room structures around courtyards, with ground floors for storage and workshops and upper floors for living quarters. Public buildings that include what appears to be a palace complex, complete with administrative areas, ceremonial spaces, and storage facilities for the tribute and trade goods that flowed through the city. The pottery found in Troy's 6 levels includes both local Anatolian styles and imported Greek ceramics, proving trade connections across the Aegean that match the international scope of Homer's war. Mycenaean pottery found in Troy's 6 contexts shows that Greeks were indeed visiting the city during the late Bronze Age, whether as traders, diplomats, or perhaps even as enemies. But Troy 6 was destroyed not by human enemies, but by an earthquake around 1300 BCE. The archaeological evidence is clear. Walls collapsed in patterns consistent with seismic activity, buildings were crushed by falling debris, and there are no signs of the fire and violence that would indicate military conquest. Whatever historical memories might have inspired Homer's epic, they don't come from the destruction of Troy 6. Troy 7th A, built on the ruins of its predecessor, presents a very different picture. This city, dating from about 1300 to 1180 BCE, shows clear signs of a community under pressure. The reconstruction was hasty, with inferior building techniques and crowded conditions that suggest a population trying to maximize defensive capabilities rather than comfortable living. Most tellingly, Troy 7a shows evidence of preparations for siege. Large storage jars, pithoi, were buried in the floors of houses, apparently to hide food supplies from potential attackers. The city's wells were deepened and protected, suggesting concern about maintaining water supplies during a prolonged siege. The population appears to have been larger than Troy 6, as if refugees from the surrounding countryside had crowded inside the walls for protection. The destruction of Troy 7a around 1180 BCE shows clear signs of human violence. The city burned in a massive fire that left ash layers several feet thick. Human remains found in the destruction debris show signs of violent death. Crushed skulls, embedded arrowheads, and other trauma consistent with urban warfare. Unlike Troy 6, this destruction was clearly the result of enemy action, but the archaeological evidence for a great siege remains frustratingly ambiguous. While Troy 7 was certainly destroyed by violence, the scale of that violence is unclear. The city was much smaller than Homer's descriptions suggest, perhaps 200 meters across at its widest point, capable of housing a few thousand people at most. This isn't the vast metropolis that supposedly required a 10-year siege by the greatest army ever assembled. The attacking force also appears to have been much smaller than Homer's coalition of 100,000 warriors. Archaeological surveys of the surrounding plain have found no evidence of a large military camp, no traces of the siege works that would be necessary for a prolonged assault, and no artifacts that would indicate the presence of a massive army for an extended period. While the archaeological evidence from Troy itself provides tantalizing but incomplete information about what happened there in the Late Bronze Age, Hittite archives discovered at their capital of Hattusa offer a different kind of evidence that may be even more valuable for understanding the historical background of the Trojan War. The Hittite Empire, centered in what is now central Turkey, was one of the great superpowers of the Late Bronze Age world. Their royal archives, preserved in cuneiform script on clay tablets, contain thousands of documents that illuminate the political and diplomatic relationships of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 13th and 12th centuries BCE. Among these documents are several that mention a place called Wilusa, located in the far west of Anatolia and apparently controlling important trade routes. The linguistic connection between Wilusa and Ilios, Homer's name for Troy, is compelling. In the Hittite language, W sounds often correspond to I sounds in Greek, making Wilusa a plausible Hittite rendering of the Greek Troy. More importantly, the Hittite documents describe political relationships between Wilusa and the great powers of the Bronze Age world that match the international scope of Homer's war. Wilusa had treaty relationships with the Hittite Empire, was wealthy enough to be worth diplomatic attention, and was located in exactly the region where ancient sources placed Troy. One tablet describes a treaty between the Hittite king and a ruler of Wilusa named Alexandru, a name that bears striking resemblance to Alexandros, which was Paris's actual name in some versions of the Troy story. While this could be coincidence, the accumulation of such connections suggests that the Hittite archives may preserve genuine historical memories that were later incorporated into Greek epic tradition. Other Hittite documents mention conflicts between the empire and a people called the Ahiyawa, who most scholars identify with the Bronze Age Greeks, Achaeans. These texts describe raids, territorial disputes, and diplomatic tensions that could easily have escalated into the kind of major war that Homer describes. Most intriguingly, some Hittite texts mention a troublemaker named Piamaradu, who seems to have been leading raids against Hittite territory from a base somewhere in western Anatolia. Could this be a garbled historical memory of Priam, Troy's king? The linguistic connection is speculative, but the general picture of Greek-Hittite conflict in the region where Troy stood matches the geopolitical background that the epic tradition assumes. To understand what really happened at Troy, we need to place it in the context of the broader catastrophe that destroyed Bronze Age civilization throughout the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. This event, which archaeologists call the Bronze Age collapse, saw the simultaneous destruction of the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean palace system in Greece, and numerous other kingdoms and cities throughout the region. The causes of this collapse remain hotly debated among scholars. Climate change may have disrupted agricultural systems, leading to famine and social unrest. Internal rebellions might have weakened centralized governments. New military technologies, particularly iron weapons and new tactics, could have given advantages to previously marginal groups. But one factor that appears in many contemporary sources is the activities of groups that Egyptian texts call the Sea Peoples, maritime raiders who attacked coastal cities throughout the eastern Mediterranean. These groups, whose ethnic and cultural identities remain unclear, may have included displaced populations from earlier conflicts, mercenaries whose services were no longer needed, or opportunistic raiders taking advantage of weakened kingdoms. Could the Sea Peoples have included Greeks who, after destroying Troy, found themselves with military forces that had no peaceful occupation to return to? Could the Trojan War have been not just a conflict between Troy and Greece, but part of the broader pattern of violence and displacement that destroyed Bronze Age civilization? This broader context helps explain some puzzling aspects of the Troy story. The complete destruction of Troy 7a with no evidence of subsequent rebuilding on the same scale matches the pattern of urban collapse seen throughout the region. The disappearance of Mycenaean palace culture in Greece shortly after the traditional date of Troy's fall suggests that the war's victors were themselves victims of the larger civilizational breakdown. If Troy really fell around 1180 BCE, its destruction would have been part of the greatest catastrophe in Bronze Age history, a systemic collapse that ended an entire way of life and ushered in the Greek Dark Age that lasted for centuries. The archaeological evidence reveals a complex picture that both supports and challenges the literary tradition. There really was a great city where ancient sources placed Troy, and it really was destroyed by violence around the time when the war supposedly occurred. But the scale of both the city and the conflict was much smaller than Homer's epic suggests, and the destruction of Troy was part of a much larger pattern of Bronze Age civilizational collapse. What emerges is not the clear confirmation or refutation that earlier generations of scholars hoped for, but something more interesting, evidence for historical events that were probably dramatic enough to inspire oral traditions, but which were transformed by centuries of poetic elaboration into the immortal story that Homer crystallized in the Iliad and Odyssey. The final question is not whether the Trojan War happened, but what the relationship between historical events and poetic imagination tells us about how human societies create meaning from their past. After 6 hours of investigation, examining archaeological evidence, ancient sources, and scholarly debates, we can finally attempt to answer the question that began our journey. What really happened at Troy over 3,000 years ago? The evidence suggests that there was indeed a historical conflict that inspired the literary tradition we know as the Trojan War. Around 1180 BCE, during the final collapse of Bronze Age civilization, a city that the Hittites called Wilusa and the Greeks called Ilios was destroyed by enemies who burned it so thoroughly that it was never rebuilt on the same scale. This historical Troy was probably a wealthy trading city that controlled access to the Dardanelles and profited from taxing ships that wanted to reach the Black Sea. Its wealth and strategic position would have made it a natural target for raiders during the chaotic period when Bronze Age kingdoms were collapsing throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The attackers were probably Greek warriors from the Mycenaean world, though they may have been part of the broader phenomenon that Egyptian sources call the Sea Peoples, displaced populations and opportunistic raiders who contributed to the Bronze Age collapse. The conflict might have lasted years rather than the epic's 10, and involved hundreds rather than thousands of warriors on each side. But this historical kernel was gradually transformed by oral tradition into something much grander. As the Bronze Age world faded into memory and the Greek Dark Age progressed, bards preserved and elaborated the story of Troy's fall, adding supernatural elements, expanding the cast of characters, and increasing the scale of events until a local conflict became a cosmic drama. Homer's genius lay not in historical accuracy, but in psychological truth. Whether or not there ever was an Achilles who chose between long life and eternal glory, the choice itself resonates with universal human experience. Whether or not Helen of Troy was the most beautiful woman who ever lived, her story explores timeless themes about love, duty, and the consequences of personal choices. The archaeological evidence confirms that Homer preserved genuine memories of Bronze Age material culture, the weapons, armor, burial practices, and palace systems that had vanished from Greek experience by his time. But he combined these accurate details with mythological elements and contemporary references that transformed historical memory into immortal art. The reason the Trojan War has captivated human imagination for 3 millennia isn't its historical accuracy, but its exploration of themes that remain relevant regardless of time or culture. The story functions as a meditation on war itself, its causes, conduct, and consequences, that speaks to every generation that has experienced the tragedy of armed conflict. At its deepest level, the Iliad is about the tension between individual excellence and social responsibility. Achilles represents the ultimate warrior, a man whose personal prowess surpasses ordinary human limitations. But his greatness also makes him dangerous to the very community he's supposed to protect. His withdrawal from battle nearly dooms the Greek expedition, while his return brings victory at enormous cost. This tension between individual and community remains relevant in any society that values both personal achievement and collective welfare. Modern audiences recognize Achilles' dilemma in contemporary debates about leadership, celebrity, and the responsibilities that come with exceptional talent or power. Helen's story explores equally universal themes about desire, choice, and responsibility. Whether she went to Troy willingly or was abducted, her presence there triggers a war that destroys 2 civilizations. Her beauty becomes both a blessing and a curse, bringing her everything she might desire while making her responsible for consequences she never intended. The questions raised by Helen's story, how much responsibility do we bear for the unintended consequences of our choices, remain as relevant today as they were in the Bronze Age. Every generation must grapple with the relationship between personal freedom and social obligation, between following one's heart and fulfilling one's duties. The broader narrative of the war itself functions as a cautionary tale about the costs of prolonged conflict. The Greeks achieve their objective, they recover Helen and destroy Troy, but victory brings them no happiness. The war corrupts the victors, destroys their moral authority, and ultimately leads to their own civilization's collapse. This theme resonates particularly strongly with modern audiences who have witnessed how military victories can become strategic defeats, how wars begun for limited objectives can escalate beyond anyone's control, and how the methods used to achieve victory can undermine the values that supposedly justified the conflict in the first place. The story's treatment of divine intervention speaks to persistent human questions about fate, free will, and moral responsibility. The gods in Homer don't simply impose their will on helpless mortals, but work through human psychology, amplifying existing desires and conflicts until they produce dramatic consequences. This sophisticated view of causation, where divine will, human choice, and random chance interact in complex ways, offers a more nuanced understanding of historical causation than simple explanations based on individual decisions or impersonal forces. The impact of the Trojan War story on Western civilization extends far beyond literature into politics, philosophy, art, and popular culture. From ancient Rome to modern Hollywood, the themes and characters of Homer's epics have provided a vocabulary for discussing war, heroism, love, and loss that shapes how entire cultures understand these experiences. For the Romans, the Troy story became a foundation myth that explained their own origins and destiny. Virgil's Aeneid transformed the Trojan prince Aeneas into the ancestor of the Roman people, creating a narrative that justified Roman expansion as the fulfillment of Troy's legacy. This wasn't just literary creativity but political ideology. Romans could see themselves as the rightful heirs of Troy's greatness, destined to surpass even the Greeks who had destroyed their ancestor city. Medieval Europe inherited the Troy story through Roman sources and transformed it again to fit Christian and feudal values. Medieval versions of the story emphasized courtly love, chivalric honor, and religious duty rather than Homer's focus on individual psychology and divine justice. Troy became a symbol of earthly glory's transience, while the war itself demonstrated the futility of worldly ambition. The Renaissance rediscovered Homer's original texts and found in them a more complex vision that matched humanist concerns about individual dignity and classical virtue. Artists like Botticelli and Rubens created visual interpretations that emphasized the beauty and tragedy of the story, while writers like Shakespeare drew on Trojan War themes in works like Troilus and Cressida that explored the gap between heroic ideals and political reality. The modern era has found new relevance in the story's treatment of trauma, moral injury, and the psychological costs of violence. Contemporary adaptations often focus on the war's impact on ordinary soldiers, rather than heroic leaders, using Homer's insights about the dehumanizing effects of prolonged conflict to illuminate modern experiences of warfare. Films like Troy and novels like The Silence of the Girls reinterpret ancient themes for contemporary audiences, often emphasizing female perspectives and questioning traditional assumptions about heroism and glory. These adaptations demonstrate the story's continued ability to generate new meanings while preserving its essential insights about human nature. The archaeological discoveries at Troy have added another dimension to the story's cultural impact, raising questions about the relationship between historical fact and artistic truth that extend far beyond this particular case. The debate about Troy's historicity has influenced how we think about oral tradition, cultural memory, and the reliability of ancient sources for reconstructing the past. More broadly, the Troy story has become a template for understanding how societies create meaningful narratives from historical events. The transformation of a Bronze Age local conflict into a cosmic drama about love, war, and human destiny demonstrates the power of storytelling to create shared values and cultural identity. And so we reach the end of our journey through 30 centuries of history, archaeology, and imagination. We began on a windswept hill in Turkey, where Heinrich Schliemann stood with Homer's Iliad in hand, convinced that archaeology could prove poetry true. We end with a more complex but ultimately more satisfying understanding of how historical events become immortal stories. The Trojan War probably happened, but not as Homer described it. There really was a wealthy city where ancient sources placed Troy, and it really was destroyed by violence around the time the epic tradition suggests. But the historical conflict was smaller, shorter, and more brutal than the literary version, lacking the supernatural elements and philosophical sophistication that make Homer's poetry immortal. What transforms historical events into timeless art isn't accuracy, but insight, the ability to find in particular circumstances universal truths about human experience. Homer's genius lay not in preserving facts, but in creating characters and situations that speak to fundamental aspects of human nature that transcend any particular time or culture. The archaeological evidence confirms that Bronze Age bards preserved genuine memories of a vanished world, but they combined those memories with mythological imagination and contemporary concerns to create something greater than simple historical record. The result is a story that illuminates not just what happened in the Bronze Age, but what it means to be human in any age. Whether or not Achilles ever lived, his choice between long life and eternal glory reflects dilemmas that face anyone who must balance personal happiness against lasting achievement. Whether or not Helen was the most beautiful woman who ever lived, her story explores the relationship between desire and responsibility that shapes every human relationship. The walls of Troy have fallen twice, once to Bronze Age enemies around 1180 BCE, and again to the patient work of archaeologists who have revealed the gap between historical reality and poetic imagination. But the story of Troy remains standing, as powerful and relevant today as it was when Homer first sang of the rage of Achilles and the face that launched 1,000 ships. In the end, that may be the most important truth of all, that human beings need stories as much as they need facts, that meaning matters as much as accuracy, and that the greatest truth about the Trojan War isn't whether it happened exactly as Homer described, but that we continue to find in his description insights that help us understand ourselves and our world. The war is over, the heroes are dead, and the city has fallen to ruin. But the story lives on, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom and tragic beauty of human experience from one generation to the next. And that, perhaps, is victory enough.